Welcome, weary traveler, to a gentle journey through some of history's most magnificent yet often overlooked civilizations. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet comfort of rest, allow your mind to drift across the golden sands of the Sahara, through ancient trading cities of unimaginable wealth, and into the heart of empires that rivaled anything the medieval world had ever seen. This is the story of African empires, a world of gold and salt, of scholar kings and warrior queens, of universities older than Oxford and cities that glittered beneath the African sun. For centuries, these kingdoms flourished while Europe slumbered through its so-called Dark Ages. Caravans laden with treasure crossed endless deserts. Libraries overflowed with manuscripts, and emperors so wealthy that their generosity crashed foreign economies walked these ancient lands. In the hours ahead, we will wander together through 99 fascinating windows into these extraordinary civilizations. There is no need to remember everything you hear, no test to prepare for, no notes to take. Simply let these gentle facts wash over you like a warm breeze across the savannah. Some may linger in your memory, others may drift away like dust across the desert, and that is perfectly fine. So take a deep breath, release the tensions of your day, and allow yourself to be carried back through the mists of time. The golden courts of Mali await. The scholars of Timbuktu turn their ancient pages, and the stone towers of Great Zimbabwe rise against the horizon. Let us begin our journey together, one gentle fact at a time, as you drift peacefully toward the shores of sleep. Fact 1. The Land of Gold. Long before European explorers ever set foot on African soil, Arab traders and geographers spoke in hushed, almost disbelieving tones about a mysterious land they called Bilad al-Sudan, which simply meant the land of the black peoples. But it was not the people that captured their imagination most powerfully. It was the gold. So much gold that it seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale whispered around desert campfires. These traders described a place where gold grew from the ground like carrots, where nuggets the size of fists could be plucked from riverbeds, where the metal was so abundant that dogs wore golden collars and horses were hitched to golden posts. While some of these stories were exaggerated, the core truth remained startling. West Africa, particularly the region between the Senegal and Niger rivers, contained some of the richest gold deposits the ancient world had ever known. This gold would fuel the rise of three great empires over nearly 1,000 years. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai would each, in turn, control these precious deposits and grow unimaginably wealthy from their trade. The gold flowed north across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean world, funding the treasuries of distant caliphs and eventually finding its way into the coins of medieval Europe. 2/3 of the gold circulating in the medieval Mediterranean world came from West Africa, a staggering figure that speaks to the immense wealth hidden beneath the African sun. Fact 2. The Ghana Empire's misleading name. The first of the great West African empires was Ghana, though this ancient kingdom should not be confused with the modern country that bears its name today. The modern nation of Ghana, located on the Atlantic coast, actually lies several hundred miles southeast of where the original Ghana Empire flourished. When the modern country gained independence in 1957, its leaders chose the name Ghana as a tribute to this glorious African past, even though the ancient empire had occupied different territory entirely. The original Ghana Empire, which historians sometimes call Ouagadougou to avoid confusion, emerged around the 6th century in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. The empire was founded by the Sonic people, and at its height, it controlled territory roughly the size of modern Texas. The word Ghana itself was not the name of the land, but rather a title meaning warrior king, used by the Sonic rulers. Arab writers, hearing this title, assumed it was the name of the entire kingdom and began referring to it as Ghana in their chronicles. The empire's capital city was Kumbhi-Sala, a sprawling urban center divided into two distinct towns about 6 miles apart. One town was Muslim, home to Arab and Berber merchants who had crossed the Sahara to trade. The other town was the royal city, where the Ghana ruled from his palace, surrounded by sacred groves where traditional religious ceremonies took place. Fact 3. The secret of Ghana's wealth. The Ghana Empire's extraordinary wealth came not from producing gold itself, though gold certainly flowed through its markets. Instead, Ghana grew rich by controlling the trade routes between the gold-producing regions to the south and the salt-hungry markets to the north. The empire positioned itself as the essential middleman, taxing every ounce of gold heading north and every block of salt heading south. Salt may seem an unlikely source of wealth to modern ears, but in the ancient world, it was quite literally worth its weight in gold. In the tropical regions south of Ghana, where the gold was mined, salt was desperately scarce. People needed salt to survive, to preserve food, and to feed their livestock. Meanwhile, the Sahara Desert contained vast salt deposits, particularly at places like Tagaza, where entire buildings were constructed from blocks of salt. Merchants would carve these blocks and load them onto camels for the long journey south. Ghana's rulers understood that whoever controlled where these two precious commodities met controlled everything. They established trading posts and collection points where merchants from north and south would gather. The Ghana imposed taxes on all goods entering and leaving his territory, and he maintained a royal monopoly on gold nuggets, allowing only gold dust to be traded freely. This careful economic management transformed Ghana from a regional power into an empire of legendary wealth. Fact 4. The silent trade. One of the most fascinating aspects of the gold trade in ancient Ghana was a practice known as the silent trade, or dumb barter. This unusual method of commerce developed because the gold miners in the southern forests wished to keep the locations of their mines secret and had no desire for direct contact with foreign merchants. The result was a trading system conducted entirely without words or face-to-face meetings. Here's how it worked. Merchants from the north would travel to designated trading spots along rivers, usually at the edge of the forest. There, they would lay out their goods, typically salt, cloth, and copper, arranging them in neat piles on the ground. Then they would beat drums to signal their presence and retreat out of sight. The local gold miners would emerge from the forest, examine the goods, and place what they considered a fair amount of gold dust beside each pile. Then they too would withdraw. The merchants would return and inspect the gold. If they found the amount acceptable, they would take the gold and leave, beating their drums again to signal the transaction was complete. If they wanted more gold, they would simply wait. The miners would return, see that the goods remained, and add more gold or remove some of their offer. This back and forth could continue for days until both parties were satisfied. Though seemingly primitive, this system worked remarkably well for centuries. Fact 5. The splendor of the Ghana king. Arab travelers who visited the Ghana Empire left vivid descriptions of the extraordinary splendor surrounding its rulers. The most detailed account comes from the geographer al-Bakri, writing in 1067, who described the Ghana's court in terms that would not seem out of place in describing the most magnificent European or Asian monarchs of the age. His descriptions paint a picture of wealth, ceremony, and power that astounded medieval readers. According to al-Bakri, when the Ghana held audience, he sat in a pavilion surrounded by 10 horses covered with gold-embroidered cloth. Behind him stood 10 pages carrying shields and gold-mounted swords. On his right sat the sons of vassal kings, their hair plaited with gold. The governor of the capital sat on the ground before the king, surrounded by ministers who did the same. The entrance to the pavilion was guarded by dogs wearing collars of gold and silver, and these dogs reportedly never left the king's presence. When subjects approached the Ghana, they would fall on their knees and sprinkle dust on their heads as a sign of respect. Muslims, however, were exempted from this practice and were permitted to simply clap their hands as greeting. The Ghana dispensed justice, collected tribute from vassal states, and maintained a standing army reportedly numbering 200,000 warriors. Such was the majesty of this African monarch that few who witnessed it ever forgot. Fact 6. The fall of Ghana. Like all empires, Ghana eventually declined, though historians debate the exact causes of its fall. The traditional explanation points to the Almoravid invasion of 1076, when Berber warriors from the Western Sahara, fired with religious zeal to spread their strict interpretation of Islam, attacked Ghana's capital. According to this narrative, the Almoravids destroyed Kumbi Sala and fatally weakened the empire, which never recovered its former glory. However, more recent scholarship suggests the reality was more complicated. While the Almoravids certainly raided Ghana and may have briefly occupied its capital, the empire lingered on for another century and a half in diminished form. Archaeological evidence suggests that Kumbi Sala remained inhabited well into the 13th century, and some historians now believe that environmental factors played as large a role as military conquest in Ghana's decline. The Sahara Desert was slowly expanding southward during this period, a process called desertification, which threatened the agricultural lands that fed Ghana's population. Meanwhile, new gold deposits were being discovered further south, shifting the economic center of gravity away from Ghana's sphere of control. By the early 13th century, the Songhai kingdom had fragmented into smaller states, each competing for the remnants of Ghana's wealth. Into this power vacuum would step a new force, the rising empire of Mali, destined to eclipse Ghana's glory entirely. Fact 7. The legend of Sundiata. The Mali Empire was born from legend, specifically the legend of Sundiata Keita, one of the most celebrated heroes in all of African history. His story, passed down through centuries by griots, the oral historians of West Africa, reads like a fairy tale of triumph over impossible odds. Yet behind the legend stood a real historical figure who transformed a small kingdom into the greatest empire West Africa had ever seen. According to tradition, Sundiata was born around 1217 to a king of the small Mandinka state of Kingaba. A prophecy had foretold that this child would grow to become a mighty ruler, but when Sundiata was born, he appeared anything but destined for greatness. The boy could not walk. For years, he crawled on the ground while other children ran and played, and many in the kingdom mocked him and his mother, who was one of the king's less favored wives. When Sundiata's father died, a cruel new king took power and persecuted Sundiata's family. The young prince and his mother were forced into exile, wandering from kingdom to kingdom for years. It was during this period of hardship that Sundiata finally learned to walk, reportedly pulling himself upright using an iron rod that bent under his strength. The crippled child had become a powerful young man, and he had not forgotten the prophecy that said he would one day rule. Fact 8. The Battle of Karina. The climax of Sundiata's legendary rise came at the Battle of Karina in 1235, one of the most important battles in African history. By this time, the remnants of the Ghana Empire and the Mandinka homelands had fallen under the control of Semenguru Kanti, a fearsome sorcerer king of the Sasso people. Semenguru was renowned for his cruelty and his magical powers, which made him seem invincible. He had killed 11 of Sundiata's brothers and seemed poised to extinguish the Mandinka royal line entirely. But Sundiata had spent his years in exile gathering allies and building an army. When he finally returned to challenge Semenguru, He came not as a refugee, but as a warlord at the head of a coalition of Mandinka clans and allied kingdoms, all united by their hatred of the Sasso tyrant. The two armies met at Karina, near the modern border of Mali and Guinea, and the fate of West Africa hung in the balance. The griots tell that the battle was decided partly by magic. Semenguru, despite his sorcerous powers, had one weakness: he could be harmed by the spur of a white rooster. Sundiata, knowing this secret, fitted an arrow with a rooster spur and shot the sorcerer king. Whether this magical detail is true or merely symbolic, the historical outcome is clear. Semenguru was defeated and disappeared, possibly killed, possibly fled into exile. Sundiata stood triumphant, and the Mali Empire was born. Fact 9. The Kurukan Fuga. After his victory at Karina, Sundiata did something remarkable. Rather than simply seizing power for himself, he gathered the leaders of all the allied clans and kingdoms at a great assembly called the Kurukan Fuga, sometimes called the Mandan Charter. There, according to tradition, he established a constitution for the new empire, one of the earliest known attempts at codified law in sub-Saharan Africa. The Kurukan Fuga established rules for governance, divided the empire into provinces, and set out the rights and responsibilities of different social groups. It addressed matters of slavery, declaring that no one should be enslaved merely for being related to a slave, and it established protections for women and foreigners. The charter also formalized the role of the griots as the keepers of history and tradition, a role they maintain to this day in Mali and neighboring countries. While the exact details of the Kurukan Fuga have been debated by historians, the oral tradition surrounding it was strong enough that UNESCO recognized it in 2009 as part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Whether or not every provision attributed to the charter was actually established in 1235, the Kurukan Fuga represents an important moment in African political thought, demonstrating that sophisticated concepts of constitutional governance existed in Africa centuries before European colonization. Fact 10. The city of Niani. Sundiata established his capital at Niani, a city on the upper Niger River that would serve as the heart of the Mali Empire for over 2 centuries. Unlike the divided capital of Ghana, Niani was a single unified city that grew to become one of the largest urban centers in the medieval world. At its height, the city may have housed over 100,000 inhabitants, a population that would have made it comparable to the great cities of Europe and the Middle East. Niani was strategically located at the intersection of several important trade routes, allowing it to control commerce flowing in multiple directions. The Niger River provided transportation and water, while nearby gold fields ensured a steady flow of wealth. The surrounding countryside was fertile enough to support the large population, and the location was defensible against potential enemies. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler who visited Mali in 1352, described the empire's court, but did not visit Niani itself. However, other sources describe a bustling city with distinct quarters for different groups: merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and the royal household. Archaeological excavations at the site believed to be Niani have revealed the foundations of substantial buildings and artifacts that confirm its importance. Yet much of ancient Niani remains unexcavated, its full secrets still buried beneath the African soil. Fact 11. The griots of Mali. No discussion of the Mali Empire would be complete without mentioning the griots, the remarkable hereditary class of oral historians, musicians, and storytellers who preserved and transmitted the history of the Mandinka people across generations. In a culture where writing was limited primarily to Arabic and used mainly for religious and commercial purposes, the griots served as living libraries, memorizing vast amounts of information and passing it to their children. The role of griot was hereditary and carried both great honor and certain social restrictions. Griots could not be enslaved and were protected by custom, but they also could not marry outside their caste. They served as advisors to kings, entertainers at celebrations, and mediators in disputes. Most importantly, they were the keepers of genealogies, remembering the ancestors of noble families going back countless generations. The griot tradition continues today in Mali, Senegal, Guinea, and other countries of West Africa. Modern griots still perform at weddings and naming ceremonies, still sing the praises of important families, and still recite the epic of Sundiata to audiences who have heard it many times before. Some have become international celebrities, adapting traditional music to contemporary styles while maintaining their role as cultural guardians. Through them, the history of the Mali Empire lives on, not in dusty books, but in living memory. Fact 12. Mansa Musa takes the throne. Nearly a century after Sundiata founded the Mali Empire, a new ruler came to power who would become the most famous African monarch in history. His name was Musa Keita, though he is better known by his title, Mansa Musa, meaning King Musa or Emperor Musa. His reign, which began around 1312 and lasted approximately 25 years, marked the absolute pinnacle of Mali's wealth, power, and prestige. Mansa Musa came to the throne under unusual circumstances. According to tradition, his predecessor, Mansa Abu Bakr II, became obsessed with exploring the Atlantic Ocean. The previous Mansa equipped a fleet of 400 boats and sailed westward into the unknown, never to return. Some historians have speculated that these explorers may have reached the Americas nearly 2 centuries before Columbus, though no solid evidence supports this intriguing possibility. What is certain is that Abu Bakr's disappearance left the throne vacant for Musa. Unlike the mysterious Abu Bakr, Mansa Musa was less interested in geographic exploration than in consolidating and expanding his already vast empire. Under his rule, Mali grew to encompass an area larger than Western Europe, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the borders of modern Nigeria. He conquered new territories, strengthened the administration of existing provinces, and transformed Mali into a major center of Islamic learning. But it was a single journey that would make his name immortal. Fact 13. The Hajj that shook the world. In 1324, Mansa Musa embarked on the pilgrimage to Mecca that every devout Muslim is expected to make at least once in their lifetime. The Hajj was not unusual for a Muslim ruler, but nothing about Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was ordinary. He traveled with an entourage so vast and carried so much gold that his journey became legendary even before he returned home. It remains one of the most extravagant displays of wealth in recorded history. According to various accounts, Mansa Musa's caravan included 60,000 men, including 12,000 personal slaves, each carrying 4 pounds of gold bars. 500 slaves marched ahead of the king, each carrying a golden staff, weighing approximately 6 pounds. 80 camels carried between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust each. The total amount of gold Mansa Musa brought on his Hajj may have exceeded 12 tons, worth billions of dollars in modern currency. The caravan stretched for miles across the desert, a moving city of tents and supplies, soldiers and servants, scholars and holy men. Wherever Mansa Musa stopped, he distributed gold with legendary generosity. He gave gifts to officials who assisted him, alms to the poor, and payments for supplies. He built a new mosque every Friday, the Muslim holy day. Throughout his journey, nothing like this procession had ever been seen before, and nothing like it would ever be seen again. Fact 14. Crashing Cairo's economy. When Mansa Musa's golden caravan reached Cairo, Egypt, in July 1324, the results were spectacular and catastrophic in equal measure. The Malian emperor stayed in Cairo for 3 months, during which time he and his followers distributed so much gold in gifts, purchases, and charity that they inadvertently crashed the Egyptian economy. The sudden flood of gold into the market caused the metal's value to plummet, triggering an inflation crisis that took over a decade to resolve. Contemporary chroniclers recorded the economic chaos with a mixture of awe and dismay. Gold prices in Cairo, Medina, and Mecca declined by as much as 25% and remained depressed for 12 years. Merchants who had suddenly found themselves awash in Malian gold discovered that their new wealth bought less and less as prices rose across the economy. The inflation caused real hardship for ordinary Egyptians, even as it demonstrated the almost unimaginable scale of Mali's riches. Mansa Musa reportedly felt some remorse when he learned of the damage his generosity had caused. On his return journey through Cairo, he attempted to remedy the situation by borrowing back gold at high interest rates from Egyptian merchants, thereby removing some of the excess gold from circulation. Whether this was effective in stabilizing the economy or simply added to the complexity of the situation, historians cannot say. But the story illustrates a key truth. Mansa Musa was so wealthy that his gifts alone could destabilize the economy of a major civilization. Fact 15. The richest person in history. Modern economists and historians have attempted to calculate Mansa Musa's wealth in contemporary terms, and the numbers are staggering. Various estimates have placed his net worth at around $400 billion, a figure that would make him not just the richest person of his time, but potentially the wealthiest individual who has ever lived. This calculation takes into account Mali's gold production, tax revenues, and control of the Trans-Saharan trade. To put this in perspective, Mansa Musa's estimated wealth exceeded that of modern billionaires like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates combined, even adjusted for inflation. His annual income from gold alone may have exceeded the entire economic output of many contemporary European kingdoms. The Mali Empire was, quite simply, swimming in gold at a time when gold was the universally recognized store of value and medium of exchange. Of course, such comparisons across centuries are inherently imprecise. The modern economy operates on principles utterly different from medieval commerce, and converting ancient wealth to modern dollars involves numerous assumptions. But even the most conservative estimates place Mansa Musa among the wealthiest humans ever, a remarkable achievement for an African emperor whom many Western history books have overlooked entirely. His story reminds us that the history of wealth and power extends far beyond the familiar names and places of European history. Fact 16. Timbuktu rises. After returning from his Hajj, Mansa Musa devoted enormous resources to transforming the Mali Empire into a center of Islamic learning and culture. His most lasting legacy was the development of Timbuktu, a city that would become synonymous with wealth, scholarship, and the mysterious allure of Africa itself. Under Mansa Musa's patronage, Timbuktu grew from a prosperous trading post into one of the intellectual capitals of the medieval world. Timbuktu's location was its fortune. The city sat at the precise point where the Niger River came closest to the Sahara Desert, making it the natural meeting place for river commerce from the south and caravan trade from the north. Traders from across Africa and the Mediterranean gathered there to exchange gold, salt, slaves, cloth, books, and countless other commodities. The wealth generated by this commerce funded the cultural flowering that Mansa Musa encouraged. The emperor invited scholars and architects from across the Islamic world to come to Timbuktu. Among those who accepted was the famous Andalusian architect and poet Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who accompanied Mansa Musa back from his pilgrimage. Al-Sahili introduced new architectural styles to Mali, including the burned brick construction and distinctive flat-roofed design that came to characterize Timbuktu's mosques and important buildings. The city was being transformed from a trading post into a monument to learning and faith. Fact 17. The Jingarubber Mosque. The crowning architectural achievement of Mansa Musa's reign was the Jingarubber Mosque in Timbuktu, commissioned by the emperor and designed by Abu Ishaq al-Sahili around 1327. This magnificent structure, built from mud brick and wood in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architectural style, served as the city's main mosque and remains standing today, nearly 700 years after its construction. Al-Sahili was reportedly paid 200 kilograms of gold for his work on the mosque, a fortune that speaks both to Mansa Musa's wealth and to his commitment to creating a worthy monument. The building could accommodate up to 2,000 worshippers and featured 3 inner courts, 2 minarets, and 25 rows of pillars aligned from east to west. The walls, made of sun-dried mud bricks reinforced with wooden beams, gave the mosque its distinctive appearance, at once imposing and organic. The Jingarubber Mosque has required constant maintenance over the centuries, as mud brick structures must be regularly replastered to survive the rainy season. This maintenance has become a community ritual in Timbuktu, with volunteers gathering each year to apply fresh coats of mud to the mosque's walls. The building was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988, though it has faced threats from regional instability in recent years. Despite these challenges, it stands as a testament to Mansa Musa's vision of Mali as a center of Islamic civilization. Fact 18. The Sankore University. Perhaps even more significant than Timbuktu's mosques was its role as a center of learning. The Sankore Mosque, which predated Mansa Musa but was greatly expanded during his reign, became the nucleus of what historians call the University of Sankore. This was not a university in the modern sense of a single institution with a unified administration. Instead, it was a cluster of private schools and libraries, all centered around the mosque, where scholars gathered to teach, study, and debate. At its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, Sankore may have enrolled as many as 25,000 students, a staggering number for any medieval institution. Students came from across Africa and the Islamic world to study theology, law, grammar, rhetoric, logic, astronomy, mathematics, history, and geography. The language of instruction was Arabic, the scholarly lingua franca of the medieval Muslim world, though many scholars were native speakers of Mandinka, Songhai, or other African languages. The scholars of Sankore produced thousands of manuscripts on every conceivable subject. Many of these books were painstakingly copied by hand, creating multiple versions that spread throughout the Islamic world. Others were original works of scholarship, contributing new knowledge to fields ranging from jurisprudence to medicine. The library collections of Timbuktu's scholars reportedly numbered in the hundreds of thousands of volumes, rivaling or exceeding the great libraries of Europe and the Middle East. Fact 19. The manuscripts of Timbuktu. One of the most remarkable aspects of Timbuktu's scholarly legacy is that so many of its manuscripts have survived to the present day. Despite centuries of instability, foreign conquest, colonial exploitation, and environmental challenges, an estimated 300,000 to 700,000 manuscripts from Timbuktu and surrounding regions have been preserved, many of them in private family collections that have guarded these treasures for generations. These manuscripts cover an astonishing range of subjects. There are Qurans, of course, beautifully illuminated with geometric patterns and calligraphy. But there are also treatises on astronomy that calculated the orbits of planets, medical texts describing surgical procedures and herbal remedies, legal documents recording contracts and court decisions, poetry collections celebrating love and faith, and historical chronicles recording the rise and fall of kingdoms. Some manuscripts combine multiple subjects, reflecting the broad learning of their authors. The preservation of these manuscripts has become an international concern in recent decades. Many are written on paper that has become fragile with age, and the dry, dusty climate of the Sahel takes its toll. Various projects have worked to digitize the manuscripts, catalog their contents, and train local conservators in preservation techniques. During the 2012 military conflict in Mali, local librarians heroically smuggled many manuscripts to safety, hiding them from extremists who sought to destroy anything they considered un-Islamic. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are not just historical artifacts. They are living links to an intellectual tradition that continues to inspire. Fact 20. The Mali Empire's government. The Mali Empire at its height was not simply a kingdom but a sophisticated imperial system governing dozens of distinct peoples across a vast territory. Mansa Musa and his predecessors developed administrative structures that allowed them to control this diversity while extracting the tribute and taxes that funded their magnificent projects. Understanding how Mali governed itself helps explain how a medieval African state could achieve such power and stability. At the top of the system stood the Mansa, whose authority was both political and religious. The Mansa was supreme judge, military commander, and spiritual leader, the living embodiment of the empire's unity. Below him was a complex hierarchy of officials: generals who commanded the army, governors who administered provinces, tax collectors who ensured revenue flowed to the capital, and specialized officials who oversaw everything from royal granaries to foreign ambassadors. The provinces of the Mali Empire enjoyed varying degrees of autonomy, depending on their history and strategic importance. Core provinces, particularly those containing the Mandinka heartland, were governed directly by officials appointed from the capital. Outer provinces, especially those added by conquest, were often allowed to keep their local rulers as long as they paid tribute and provided military support when called. This flexible approach allowed Mali to incorporate diverse peoples without provoking constant rebellion, creating an empire that was remarkably stable for its size and era. Fact 21. The Army of Mali. The Mali Empire's military power was formidable, though our knowledge of its exact organization remains incomplete. At its height, Mali could field an army of over 100,000 soldiers, a force capable of projecting power across the entire Western Sudan. This army conquered new territories, defended against rivals, and ensured that trade routes remained secure for the merchants whose taxes enriched the imperial treasury. The core of the Malian army was cavalry, mounted warriors who rode small but hardy horses adapted to the African environment. These horsemen provided mobility and shock power, allowing Mali's forces to strike quickly over the vast distances of the empire. They were supplemented by infantry armed with spears, swords, and bows, as well as specialized units including highly trained royal guards who protected the Mansa and his court. Mali's military success owed much to its economic resources. The empire could afford to equip its soldiers with iron weapons, chain-mail armor imported from North Africa, and the horses that gave its cavalry such an advantage. It could also afford to maintain professional soldiers rather than relying entirely on seasonal levies of farmers who needed to return home for planting and harvest. This combination of numbers, equipment, and professionalism made Mali the dominant military power of the region for over a century. Fact 22. The decline of Mali. No empire lasts forever, and the Mali Empire began its long decline in the late 14th century, roughly a generation after Mansa Musa's death. The causes were multiple and interrelated: succession disputes that weakened central authority, provincial rebellions that broke away portions of the empire, and the rise of powerful rivals who sensed opportunity in Mali's troubles. The succession problems were particularly damaging. Unlike some empires where the throne passed automatically to the eldest son, Mali's succession rules were ambiguous, and different factions championed different candidates. After Mansa Musa's death around 1337, His son Mansa Musa ruled for only 4 years before dying himself. The throne then passed to Mansa Musa's brother Suleiman, but when Suleiman died in 1360, the empire plunged into a series of civil wars that lasted decades. Meanwhile, the peripheral provinces began to break away. The Songhai people along the Middle Niger, who had been conquered by Mali in the 13th century, reasserted their independence in the 1430s under a dynamic new dynasty. The Tuareg nomads of the Sahara seized Timbuktu in 1433, depriving Mali of its most important commercial and intellectual center. By 1500, the once mighty Mali Empire had shrunk to a small state centered on the Mandinka homeland, a shadow of its former glory. Fact 23. The rise of Songhai. As Mali declined, a new power rose to take its place. The Songhai Empire, centered on the city of Gao along the Middle Niger River, would grow to become the largest empire in African history. Its rise demonstrates the cyclical nature of power in the Western Sudan, where control of the gold-salt trade could make fortunes and where military strength determined which kingdom would dominate its neighbors. The Songhai people had lived along the Niger for centuries, their origins lost in the mists of time. They had been subjects of Ghana, then conquered by Mali in the late 13th century. But they never lost their distinct identity or their ambition for independence. When Mali began to weaken, Songhai was ready to seize its chance. In 1464, a brilliant military commander named Sunni Ali became king of Songhai and began the conquests that would create an empire. Sunni Ali was a formidable warrior, spending almost his entire reign on campaign. He drove the Tuareg out of Timbuktu in 1468, capturing the city that had been Mali's intellectual capital. He conquered the wealthy trading city of Jen after a siege that lasted 7 years. He defeated Mali's forces repeatedly, reducing the once great empire to a minor power. By the time of his death in 1492, Sunni Ali had created a state that rivaled Mali at its height. Fact 24. Askia Muhammad the Great. After Sunni Ali's death, a power struggle resulted in the rise of one of West Africa's greatest rulers, Muhammad II, who took the title Askia and founded the dynasty that would rule Songhai for the next century. Askia Muhammad, as he is usually called, was not merely a conqueror but an administrator and reformer who transformed Songhai from a military state into a sophisticated empire. Askia Muhammad reorganized the government of Songhai, creating a centralized bureaucracy with specialized ministers responsible for treasury, agriculture, forests, and other aspects of administration. He standardized weights and measures throughout the empire, established uniform legal codes, and expanded the system of royal inspectors who traveled the provinces to ensure honest governance. These reforms brought a level of organization to the empire that exceeded anything Mali had achieved. Like Mansa Musa before him, Askia Muhammad made the pilgrimage to Mecca, though with somewhat less gold and spectacle. During his Hajj from 1496 to 1498, he sought religious legitimacy from the Abbasid Caliph in Cairo, who bestowed upon him the title Caliph of the Sudan. This title, while more honorific than substantive, bolstered Askia Muhammad's authority as a Muslim ruler and signaled Songhai's entry into the broader community of Islamic civilization. Under his rule, Timbuktu and Jen reached new heights as centers of learning. Fact 25. The size of Songhai. At its greatest extent under Askia Muhammad and his successors, the Songhai Empire covered approximately 1.4 million square kilometers, making it larger than any European country of the era and comparable in size to modern Peru or Mongolia. The empire stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west to the borders of modern Nigeria in the east, from the salt mines of the Central Sahara in the north to the forest kingdoms of modern Ghana in the south. This vast territory contained numerous distinct peoples speaking many different languages. The Songhai proper lived along the Niger River, but the empire also included Mandinka, Sonic, Tuareg, Fulani, Hausa, and many other groups. Each had its own traditions, languages, and social structures, which the Songhai rulers had to somehow integrate into a functioning imperial system. Governing such a diverse empire required a combination of military force and diplomatic skill. Askia Muhammad divided the territory into provinces, each governed by an official responsible to the central government. He maintained a professional army and a fleet of war canoes that could patrol the Niger River. He used Islam as a unifying ideology, promoting the religion and appointing Islamic judges who provided a common legal framework across ethnic boundaries. Through these methods, Songhai maintained its coherence for over a century. Fact 26. Timbuktu's Golden Age. Under Songhai rule, Timbuktu experienced its true golden age. While Mansa Musa had made the city famous and founded its great mosques, it was during the 15th and 16th centuries, under the patronage of the Askia dynasty, that Timbuktu reached its peak as a center of learning. Some scholars consider this period one of the high points of Islamic intellectual history, comparable to the great flowering of Baghdad or Cordoba. The city's population may have reached 50,000 or more, an enormous number for a pre-modern African city. The majority of residents were engaged in commerce, but the scholarly class was remarkably large, perhaps numbering in the thousands. Students came from across the Islamic world to study in Timbuktu, and graduates of its schools took positions of influence throughout West Africa. The city's reputation for learning became so great that to call a place a Timbuktu of knowledge was the highest compliment. The scholars of Timbuktu during this period produced their most important works. Ahmad Baba al-Timbukti, who lived from 1556 to 1627, wrote over 40 books on Islamic law, grammar, and biography, becoming the most celebrated scholar the city ever produced. Other scholars compiled histories, wrote poetry, corresponded with intellectuals in Morocco and Egypt, and debated the finer points of Islamic jurisprudence. The breadth and sophistication of this intellectual production continues to astonish modern researchers. Fact 27. The City of Jen. While Timbuktu receives most of the attention in Western accounts of medieval West Africa, another city of the Songhai Empire deserves recognition for its remarkable achievements. Jen, located in the inland delta of the Niger River in present-day Mali, was one of the oldest and most important trading centers in the region. Its great mosque, rebuilt in its current form in 1907 but based on a 13th-century design, is the largest mud brick building in the world. Jen's location gave it strategic importance. The city sat at the point where the Niger's floodwaters spread across a vast inland delta, creating fertile agricultural land and easily navigable waterways. Goods from the forest regions to the south, including gold, cola nuts, and slaves, flowed through Jen on their way north to Timbuktu and the Trans-Saharan trade routes. The city was, in effect, a gateway between two worlds. The architecture of Jen reflected its prosperity. The Great Mosque, with its distinctive towers and projecting wooden beams, has been called one of the greatest achievements of the Sudano-Sahelian architectural style. But beyond the mosque, the city was filled with impressive private homes, markets, and public buildings, all constructed from the same mud brick technique. The entire old city of Jen was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988, recognition of its outstanding universal value. Fact 28. The Trans-Saharan trade. The wealth of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai all depended on the Trans-Saharan trade, one of the most remarkable commercial networks in pre-modern history. For over 1,000 years, caravans of camels crossed the world's largest desert, carrying goods between the Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa. Understanding this trade is essential to understanding how West African empires accumulated their legendary wealth. The journey across the Sahara was one of the most dangerous voyages a merchant could undertake. The desert crossing took approximately 2 months, during which caravans faced extreme heat, sandstorms, the constant threat of water shortage, and the possibility of attack by bandits. Travelers moved from oasis to oasis, each watering stop essential for survival. A wrong turn, a delayed start, or an unexpected sandstorm could mean death for an entire caravan. Despite these dangers, the profits were so enormous that merchants considered the risks worthwhile. Gold from West Africa sold for 5 to 8 times its purchase price in North African markets. Salt, abundant in the Saharan deposits, but desperately scarce in the African tropics, brought similar markups. Luxury goods like textiles, horses, and books flowed southward, while gold, slaves, ivory, and cola nuts moved north. At its height, the Trans-Saharan trade may have moved several tons of gold across the desert each year. Fact 29. The importance of salt. To modern ears, it may seem strange that salt could be as valuable as gold, but in the pre-modern world, salt was absolutely essential for human survival. Our bodies require sodium to function, and in hot climates where people sweat heavily, the need for salt is even greater. Without access to salt, people sicken and eventually die. This biological necessity made salt one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. The Sahara Desert contained vast deposits of salt, particularly at places like Tagaza and Tadeni, where workers literally mined blocks of salt from the ground. These workers, often slaves, labored in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable, cutting and shaping salt blocks in temperatures that could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The blocks were then loaded onto camels for the long journey south to the markets of the Sudan. In the salt-poor regions of West Africa, this Saharan salt commanded extraordinary prices. Arab chroniclers reported that in some places, salt was exchanged for gold weight for weight, an almost unbelievable rate of exchange. While this rate was probably exceptional, there is no doubt that the salt trade was enormously profitable. Control of salt sources and salt trade routes was a key factor in the rise of all 3 great Sudanese empires. Fact 30. The Camel Revolution. The Trans-Saharan trade, as we know it, would have been impossible without the camel, an animal not native to Africa but introduced from Arabia sometime around the 1st century CE. The arrival of the camel in North Africa transformed the Sahara from an almost impassable barrier into a highway of commerce. This camel revolution was as significant for African history as the horse was for the conquest of the Americas. Camels are superbly adapted to desert conditions in ways that no other pack animal can match. They can travel for days without water, drawing on fat stored in their humps. Their feet spread wide on sand, preventing them from sinking. They can close their nostrils during sandstorms and survive on thorny desert vegetation that would kill a horse or donkey. A single camel can carry up to 400 pounds of cargo across terrain that would be impassable for wheeled vehicles. The peoples of the Sahara, particularly the Berber tribes who had become known as Tuareg, mastered camel husbandry and became the essential middlemen of the Trans-Saharan trade. They bred the animals, knew the desert routes, and controlled the oases where caravans had to stop for water. Without their knowledge and cooperation, the trade that enriched the Sudanese empires would have been impossible. The camel was, quite literally, the ship that sailed the desert sea. Fact 31. The fall of Songhai. The Songhai Empire came to a sudden and catastrophic end in 1591, when an army from Morocco crossed the Sahara Desert in one of the most audacious military expeditions in history. Led by a Spanish mercenary named Juder Pasha, this force of approximately 4,000 soldiers, including musketeers and artillery, marched across 1,000 miles of desert to attack the wealthiest empire in Africa. The Moroccan invasion was motivated by a desire to control the gold trade at its source. Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur of Morocco, flush with wealth from capturing a Portuguese army at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in 1578, dreamed of creating a North African empire that would rival the Ottomans. He believed that if Morocco could seize the Songhai gold fields, he would have unlimited resources to pursue his ambitions. The decisive battle came at Tondabai, north of the Songhai capital of Gao, on March 13, 1591. The Songhai army, perhaps 40,000 strong but armed mainly with spears, swords, and bows, faced the Moroccan muskets and cannons. Despite their numerical superiority, the Songhai soldiers could not withstand weapons they had never encountered before. The army broke and fled, the Askia was captured, and Songhai as an empire ceased to exist. 500 years of Sudanese imperial history came to an end in a single afternoon. Fact 32. The aftermath of conquest. The Moroccan conquest of Songhai proved to be a classic case of winning a battle but losing a war. The invaders captured the great cities of Timbuktu, Gao, and Jen, but they never found the vast gold fields they had sought. The gold-producing regions lay further south, in areas the Moroccans could not reach and did not control. Meanwhile, maintaining an army 1,000 miles from home, across the world's largest desert, proved logistically impossible. Within a few years, the Moroccan soldiers had effectively become a local ruling class, cut off from their homeland and gradually absorbed into African society. They intermarried with local women, adopted local customs, and became known as the Arma, a military aristocracy that ruled Timbuktu and the surrounding region until the 19th century. Meanwhile, Morocco's grand dreams of African empire faded as the sultans faced more pressing threats closer to home. The real losers were the peoples of the former Songhai Empire, who experienced several centuries of political fragmentation, economic decline, and periodic warfare. The sophisticated imperial administration collapsed, trade routes became unsafe, and the great intellectual traditions of Timbuktu entered a long decline. While the region eventually stabilized under new arrangements, it never recovered the unity, wealth, or scholarly distinction it had enjoyed under Songhai. Fact 33. The legacy of the Sudanese empires. The history of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai matters for reasons beyond academic interest. These empires demonstrated that sophisticated, wealthy, and powerful states existed in Africa centuries before European colonization. They produced scholars, built monuments, and created administrative systems that rivaled anything in the contemporary world. Their stories challenge stereotypes about Africa and enrich our understanding of human history. The empires of the Sudan also had lasting influence on the regions they ruled. The spread of Islam in West Africa, the development of the great trading cities, and the emergence of the Mandinka and Songhai peoples as major cultural groups all trace back to this period. The griots who still recite the epic of Sundiata, the scholars who still study the manuscripts of Timbuktu, and the communities who still maintain the mud brick mosques are all inheritors of this legacy. Yet for too long, this history was overlooked or dismissed by Western scholars who struggled to believe that Africa could have produced such achievements. The empires of the Sudan were well documented by Arab travelers and scholars, and their physical remains, from the ruins of Kumbi Sala to the standing mosques of Timbuktu and Jen, offered tangible evidence of their reality. Only in recent decades has this history received the attention it deserves, as scholars and the general public alike have discovered the remarkable story of West Africa's Golden Age. Fact 34. Great Zimbabwe. Thousands of miles from the empires of the Sudan, Another great African civilization was rising in the lands between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers. This was the culture that built Great Zimbabwe, a stunning complex of stone structures that represents the largest ancient stone construction south of the Sahara Desert. The name Zimbabwe means stone houses in the Shona language, and these stone houses were truly monumental in scale. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a wealthy medieval kingdom that flourished between approximately 1100 and 1450 CE. At its peak, the city may have housed 18,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in medieval sub-Saharan Africa. The ruling class controlled the gold trade between the inland plateau and the Swahili ports of the East African coast, accumulating wealth that funded the construction of the massive stone walls that still stand today. The most impressive structure at Great Zimbabwe is the Great Enclosure, an oval-shaped building with walls up to 11 meters high and 5 meters thick at the base. These walls were constructed entirely from precisely fitted granite blocks, assembled without mortar, yet stable enough to stand for nearly 1,000 years. The engineering skill required to build such structures was considerable, and the sheer amount of labor invested speaks to the power of Great Zimbabwe's rulers. Fact 35. The mystery of Great Zimbabwe. When European explorers encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the 19th century, they refused to believe that Africans could have built such sophisticated structures. They attributed the ruins to Phoenicians, Arabs, or even the biblical King Solomon, inventing elaborate theories to explain away the obvious evidence of African achievement. This racist dismissal of African civilization persisted well into the 20th century. The archaeological evidence, however, is clear. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the modern Shona people, who still live in the region today. Excavations have uncovered artifacts consistent with local African cultures, including distinctive pottery styles, iron tools, and gold ornaments, matching those found at other Shona sites. Radiocarbon dating confirms construction dates from the 11th through 15th centuries, exactly when local oral traditions say the kingdom flourished. Today, Great Zimbabwe is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and serves as a powerful symbol of African achievement. The modern nation of Zimbabwe took its name from these ruins when it gained independence in 1980, deliberately choosing to honor this pre-colonial heritage. The stone towers and enclosures stand as permanent rebuttal to any suggestion that sophisticated civilization was foreign to Africa. Fact 36. The wealth of Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe's wealth came from its position as a middleman in the gold trade between the African interior and the Indian Ocean trading world. The plateau regions surrounding Great Zimbabwe contained rich gold deposits, which local miners extracted using simple but effective techniques. This gold flowed through Great Zimbabwe to the coastal ports of Kilwa and Sofala, where it was exchanged for exotic imports from across Asia. Archaeological excavations at Great Zimbabwe have uncovered a remarkable array of foreign goods that speak to the extent of this trade. Chinese ceramics from the Ming Dynasty, glass beads from India, and coins from the Kilwa Sultanate have all been found among the ruins. These artifacts prove that Great Zimbabwe was connected to trade networks spanning thousands of miles, from the gold mines of southern Africa to the merchant ships of Arabia, Persia, India, and China. The ruling elite of Great Zimbabwe controlled this trade through a combination of political authority and strategic location. They taxed the gold passing through their territory, maintained relationships with both inland miners and coastal merchants, and used their wealth to fund the construction projects and military forces that maintain their power. This system worked successfully for over 3 centuries before internal conflicts and changing trade patterns led to the city's abandonment. Fact 37. The Swahili Coast. Great Zimbabwe's trading partners on the Indian Ocean coast belonged to one of Africa's most distinctive civilizations, the Swahili culture of East Africa. Along the coast of modern Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, a string of wealthy city-states developed between roughly 800 and 1500 CE. Their fortunes built on maritime trade that connected Africa to the wider world of the Indian Ocean. The Swahili civilization was a product of cultural fusion. African Bantu speakers, who had been migrating down the East African coast for centuries, encountered Arab and Persian merchants who began sailing to Africa as early as the 1st century CE. Over time, these groups intermarried, combined religious practices, and developed a new language, Swahili, which blended Bantu grammar with Arabic vocabulary. The result was a distinctive culture that was neither purely African nor purely Arab, but something new. The Swahili city-states, including Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, and Zanzibar, were primarily trading centers rather than territorial empires. They imported cloth, ceramics, glass, and other manufactured goods from the Indian Ocean world and exported African products including gold, ivory, timber, and slaves. Each city was independent, ruled by its own sultan or council, though they shared a common language, religion, and commercial culture that bound them together. Fact 38. The city of Kilwa. The wealthiest and most powerful of the Swahili city-states was Kilwa, located on an island off the coast of modern Tanzania. At its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, Kilwa dominated the gold trade from Great Zimbabwe and the southern interior, making it one of the richest cities on the Indian Ocean rim. A visiting Moroccan traveler described it as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world. Kilwa's wealth was evident in its architecture. The city's rulers constructed elaborate mosques, palaces, and merchants' houses from coral stone, a building material harvested from local reefs. The Great Mosque of Kilwa, with its domed roof and elegant columns, was one of the largest mosques in sub-Saharan Africa. The palace complex at nearby Husuni Kubwa featured over 100 rooms, including an octagonal swimming pool, and may have been the largest building in sub-Saharan Africa at the time of its construction. The city minted its own copper coins, one of the few African societies to do so, which circulated throughout the Western Indian Ocean trading world. These coins, stamped with Arabic inscriptions and the names of Kilwa sultans, have been found as far away as Oman and Australia, testimony to the extent of the city's commercial reach. Kilwa was a true cosmopolitan center, where African, Arab, Persian, and Indian cultures mingled and traded. Fact 39. The Kingdom of Congo. In the tropical forests of Central Africa, far from both the Sahara Desert and the Indian Ocean, another powerful kingdom emerged that would become one of the most significant African states of the early modern period. The Kingdom of Congo, established around 1390 in what is now northern Angola and the Western Democratic Republic of Congo, would play a major role in African history and in the tragic story of the Atlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Congo was built on the fertile lands along the Congo River and its tributaries. The river provided transportation, irrigation, and fishing, while the surrounding forests offered rich agricultural potential. The Bakongo people, who formed the kingdom's core population, practiced sophisticated farming techniques and developed skilled metalworking traditions that produced fine iron tools and copper ornaments. By the time of European contact in 1483, the Kingdom of Congo had become a substantial state with perhaps 500,000 subjects. The king, called the Mana-Congo, ruled from his capital at Mbanza-Congo, collecting tribute from provincial governors and maintaining a hierarchical administrative system. The kingdom had not developed writing, but it maintained historical records through complex oral traditions and symbolic artifacts. This was a mature African state with its own culture, religion, and political institutions. Fact 40. Congo and Portugal. The Kingdom of Congo's encounter with Portugal in 1483 marked the beginning of one of the most unusual relationships in the history of European-African contact. Unlike many later colonial interactions, the early Portuguese-Congo relationship was surprisingly equal, with both sides pursuing their own interests through diplomacy, trade, and religious exchange. The Portuguese were primarily interested in trade, particularly in slaves, which were already being exported from Congo to other African markets before European arrival. The Congolese elite were interested in European technology, particularly firearms, and in the new religion that the Portuguese brought. In 1491, the Manicongo and several members of his court converted to Christianity, establishing a tradition of Congolese Catholicism that continues to this day. For several decades, the relationship seemed beneficial to both parties. Portuguese missionaries established schools and churches in Congo, while Congolese nobles sent their sons to be educated in Lisbon. The Manicongo adopted European court etiquette, corresponded with the Portuguese king as an equal, and even received a Portuguese stone church in his capital. The two kingdoms exchanged ambassadors, and for a time, it seemed that Congo might take its place as an equal partner in the emerging Atlantic world. Fact 41. Nzinga Band. The Kingdom of Congo eventually declined under the pressure of the slave trade and Portuguese aggression, but its southern neighbor, the Mbundu Kingdom of Ndongo, produced one of Africa's most remarkable leaders, Nzinga Band, the warrior queen who defied the Portuguese for 4 decades. Her story combines diplomatic brilliance, military prowess, and personal courage in ways that still inspire admiration. Nzinga was born around 1583, the daughter of the king of Ndongo. She showed early promise as a diplomat, representing her brother in negotiations with the Portuguese in 1622. According to legend, when the Portuguese offered her no seat at the negotiations, implying she was inferior to the Portuguese governor, she commanded a servant to kneel on all fours and sat on his back, demonstrating that she would not accept a position of inferiority. When her brother died, Nzinga became Queen of Ndongo, though she faced challenges from rivals who questioned a woman's right to rule. She responded by defeating her enemies in battle and eventually conquering the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, creating a combined state that could resist Portuguese expansion. For over 30 years, she led her armies in person, fighting the Portuguese and their African allies to a standstill. She died undefeated in 1663 at approximately 80 years old, a legendary figure in African resistance to colonialism. Fact 42. The Empire of Aksum. Long before Ghana, Mali, or Songhai arose in West Africa, another great empire flourished in the highlands of East Africa. The Kingdom of Aksum, located in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, was one of the great powers of the ancient world, a commercial and military force that traded with Rome, Persia, and India. At its height in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Aksum was considered one of the 4 great empires of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Aksum's power derived from its control of the Red Sea trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean. The port of Adulis, Aksum's outlet to the sea, was one of the busiest harbors of the ancient world, receiving ships from Egypt, Arabia, India, and beyond. Through this port flowed ivory, gold, emeralds, and exotic animals from the African interior, exchanged for wine, olive oil, cloth, and manufactured goods from the Roman Empire. The Aksumites were skilled builders who constructed impressive monuments including giant stelae, or stone obelisks, some over 100 feet tall. They developed their own script, called Guizi, which is still used in Ethiopian religious texts today. Around 330 CE, the Aksumite king Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the first states in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion. This decision would shape Ethiopian culture for the next 17 centuries. Fact 43. Ethiopia's ancient Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which traces its origins to the conversion of King Azana in the 4th century, is one of the oldest Christian churches in the world and certainly the oldest in sub-Saharan Africa. This ancient Christian tradition developed in relative isolation from the rest of the Christian world, creating unique practices, art forms, and theological emphases that distinguish Ethiopian Christianity to this day. Ethiopian Christianity retained many practices that other Christian traditions abandoned centuries ago. Ethiopian Christians observe Jewish dietary laws, including restrictions on pork. They practice circumcision. They celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, as well as worshiping on Sunday. The Ethiopian Church claims to possess the Ark of the Covenant, the biblical artifact that held the Ten Commandments, which according to Ethiopian tradition was brought from Jerusalem to Ethiopia by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from solid volcanic rock in the 12th and 13th centuries, represent the most famous expression of Ethiopian Christian architecture. These 11 churches, each cut from a single block of stone, are remarkable feats of engineering and devotion. They were built during the Zagwe dynasty, whose rulers sought to create a new Jerusalem in the Ethiopian highlands. The churches are still active places of worship today, visited by thousands of pilgrims each year. Fact 44. The Solomonic Dynasty. Ethiopian political tradition held that the ruling dynasty descended from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a claim that gave Ethiopia's monarchs unique religious legitimacy. According to the national epic, the Kabra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem to meet Solomon, conceived a son by him, and returned to Ethiopia to rule. That son, Menelik I, founded a royal line that allegedly continued unbroken until 1974. The historical reality is more complicated. The dynasty that actually called itself Solomonic came to power in 1270, when a nobleman named Yakuno Amlak overthrew the Zagwe dynasty and claimed descent from the ancient Aksumite kings, who in turn were connected to Solomon. Whether this genealogy was genuine or invented for political purposes, it became the foundation of Ethiopian royal legitimacy for 7 centuries. The Solomonic dynasty presided over some of Ethiopia's greatest achievements, including the expansion of the empire to its greatest extent, the development of distinctive art and architecture, and the preservation of Ethiopia's independence during the European scramble for Africa. The dynasty produced legendary rulers like Zara Yaqub, who reformed the Ethiopian Church in the 15th century, and Menelik II, who defeated an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. The dynasty finally ended when Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed in 1974. Fact 45. The Battle of Adwa. On March 1, 1896, Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II defeated an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa, one of the most significant battles in African history. This decisive Ethiopian victory halted Italian colonial expansion into Ethiopia and made Ethiopia one of only 2 African countries, along with Liberia, to escape European colonization during the scramble for Africa. The Italian defeat was both complete and humiliating. Of approximately 18,000 Italian and Eritrean colonial troops who entered the battle, over 6,000 were killed and almost 2,000 captured. Ethiopian casualties were also heavy, perhaps 7,000 killed, but Menelik's army of over 100,000 warriors had more than enough strength to absorb these losses. The surviving Italians retreated in disorder, abandoning artillery, supplies, and their dreams of an East African empire. Adwa had significance far beyond Ethiopia. News of the African victory over a European power spread throughout the colonized world, inspiring anti-colonial movements from West Africa to the Caribbean to India. For Africans and people of African descent everywhere, Adwa proved that European military technology was not invincible and that African independence was possible. When Italy finally conquered Ethiopia under Mussolini in 1936, using poison gas against civilians, the resistance that eventually expelled them was sustained in part by the memory of Adwa. Fact 46. The Hausa city-states. Between the great empires of the Sudan and the forests of West Africa lay the land of the Hausa people, who developed a distinctive civilization of independent city-states that flourished from the 15th century onward. These states, including Kano, Katsina, Zaria, and Gobir, were never unified into a single empire, but collectively they formed one of the most important commercial and cultural regions in African history. The Hausa city-states were primarily trading centers, positioned at the southern terminus of Trans-Saharan caravan routes. They exchanged the products of the savanna and forest, including kola nuts, leather goods, and slaves, for salt, textiles, and other goods from North Africa. Hausa merchants became famous throughout West Africa for their commercial acumen, establishing trading communities in cities from Timbuktu to the Atlantic coast. Hausa culture produced distinctive artistic traditions, including elaborate architecture, beautiful textiles, and intricate leatherwork that was prized throughout the Islamic world. The Hausa language became a lingua franca of trade across much of West Africa, spoken by millions who were not ethnically Hausa. Today, Hausa remains one of Africa's most widely spoken languages, with over 40 million native speakers in Nigeria, Niger, and neighboring countries. Fact 47. The Benin Kingdom. In the forests of what is now southern Nigeria, the Kingdom of Benin developed one of the most sophisticated artistic traditions in all of Africa. This powerful state, which should not be confused with the modern country of Benin, flourished from approximately 1180 to 1897, producing bronze sculptures that rank among the greatest achievements of African art. The Benin Kingdom was ruled by an Oba, or divine king, whose palace complex in the capital city was one of the largest structures in pre-colonial Africa. The Oba controlled extensive territories through a system of hereditary chiefs and appointed officials, and he derived revenue from trade, tribute, and royal monopolies on certain goods. When Portuguese traders arrived in the 15th century, they found a well-organized state with a complex bureaucracy and a flourishing artistic tradition. The bronzes of Benin, actually made primarily from brass, depicted the Obas, their queens, warriors, and ceremonial objects with remarkable skill and detail. These works were created by guilds of metalworkers using the lost wax casting technique, a method requiring considerable technical sophistication. The bronzes adorned the palace walls, commemorated important events, and served religious functions in the cult of the divine king. When British forces conquered Benin in 1897, they looted thousands of these bronzes, which are now scattered in museums throughout the Western world. Fact 48. The Dahomey Kingdom. West of Benin, in what is now the Republic of Benin, the Kingdom of Dahomey developed a highly centralized military state that became one of the most powerful in West Africa during the 18th and 19th centuries. Dahomey was famous for its professional army, its elaborate royal ceremonies, and its notorious involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Dahomey's military organization was exceptionally sophisticated for its time and place. The kingdom maintained a standing army that included the famous Dahomey Amazons, a regiment of female warriors who served as the king's personal bodyguards and as elite fighting units. These women, who numbered between 1,000 and 6,000 depending on the period, were sworn to celibacy and devoted their lives to warfare. They fought with muskets, machetes, and their own bare hands, earning a reputation for courage and ferocity. The kings of Dahomey exercised near-absolute power over their subjects and controlled the economy with an iron grip. All trade, including the slave trade, was a royal monopoly. The annual customs ceremony, which involved human sacrifices to honor dead kings, demonstrated the ruler's power over life and death. When the French conquered Dahomey in 1894, they faced fierce resistance from the Amazons and other Dahomean forces, who only surrendered after prolonged warfare. Fact 49. The Atlantic slave trade. No account of African history can avoid the catastrophe of the Atlantic slave trade, which over 4 centuries forcibly transported approximately 12 million Africans to the Americas. This massive forced migration depopulated regions, destroyed kingdoms, and left scars that persist to the present day. Understanding its impact is essential to understanding African history. The slave trade's effects on Africa were profound and varied by region. Some coastal kingdoms, like Dahomey and Oyo, grew powerful by capturing and selling slaves from the interior. Others were devastated by slave raids that carried off their populations. The constant warfare necessary to supply the trade disrupted agriculture, undermined social structures, and prevented the kind of political consolidation that might have allowed Africans to resist European encroachment later. The demographic impact is difficult to calculate precisely, but was certainly severe. Beyond the 12 million who survived the Atlantic crossing, millions more died in slave raids, in the march to the coast, or in the horrible conditions of the slave ships. The total population loss to Africa may have exceeded 20 million people over 4 centuries, a catastrophic drain on the continent's human resources during a period when Europe's population was growing rapidly. Fact 50. The Zulu Kingdom. In southern Africa, the early 19th century saw the rise of one of the most formidable military powers in African history, the Zulu Kingdom under the leadership of Shaka, whose innovations in warfare and state organization transformed the political landscape of the entire region. The upheaval associated with Zulu expansion, known as the Mfikane, reshaped southern Africa in ways that persist to the present day. Shaka Zulu rose from humble origins to become chief of the Zulu clan around 1816. He inherited a small chiefdom of perhaps 1,500 people, but through a combination of military genius, political skill, and ruthless determination, he transformed it into an empire. He reorganized his army into disciplined regiments called impis, introduced new tactics including the famous horns of the buffalo encirclement maneuver, and replaced the traditional throwing spear with a short stabbing spear that required his warriors to close with the enemy. By the time of Shaka's assassination in 1828, the Zulu kingdom dominated a vast territory in what is now South Africa. The violence of the Mfikane sent waves of refugees fleeing in all directions, destabilizing societies from the Cape to the Great Lakes. New kingdoms emerged from the chaos, including the Ndebele in Zimbabwe and the Swazi in Swaziland. The military traditions Shaka established would later allow the Zulus to inflict a stunning defeat on British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. Fact 51. The Ashanti Empire. The forests of modern Ghana gave rise to the Ashanti Empire, one of the most powerful and wealthy states in West African history. Founded around 1670 through the unification of several Akan-speaking chiefdoms, Ashanti grew to control much of modern Ghana and beyond, creating a sophisticated political and cultural system that endured until British conquest in 1900. The symbol of Ashanti unity was the golden stool, a sacred throne that according to legend descended from heaven and landed on the lap of the first Ashanti king. The golden stool was believed to contain the soul of the Ashanti nation, and it was never sat upon, even by the king. When the British demanded to sit on the stool in 1900, the resulting outrage sparked a war. The stool was hidden and remained safe. It exists to this day as a symbol of Ashanti identity. Ashanti's wealth came from gold mining, which had been practiced in the region since ancient times, and from the trade in slaves, kola nuts, and other commodities. The Ashanti developed sophisticated goldsmithing traditions, creating intricate jewelry and ceremonial objects that displayed their wealth and craftsmanship. They also developed a system of weights for measuring gold that included small bronze figures depicting proverbs and historical scenes, creating a unique artistic tradition. Fact 52. African ironworking. One of Africa's most significant contributions to human technology was the independent development of ironworking, which African peoples mastered thousands of years ago. Archaeological evidence suggests that iron smelting in sub-Saharan Africa may date back to approximately 1200 BCE in Nigeria, potentially making African ironworking contemporary with, or even older than iron technology in the Middle East. The technology of iron smelting is complex and demanding. Iron ore must be heated to extremely high temperatures in a carefully constructed furnace, while charcoal provides both heat and the carbon necessary to reduce the ore to metal. African ironworkers developed distinctive furnace designs and smelting techniques, some of which could achieve temperatures approaching those of modern blast furnaces. These accomplishments represented indigenous African technological innovation, not imports from outside the continent. Iron transformed African societies in fundamental ways. Iron tools made agriculture more productive, allowing populations to grow and supporting the rise of complex states. Iron weapons gave military advantages to groups that mastered the technology. Iron workers often held special status in African societies, their craft surrounded by ritual and their skills passed down through carefully guarded traditions. The spread of ironworking technology accompanied the Great Bantu migrations that populated much of Central and Southern Africa. Fact 53. The Bantu migrations. One of the most significant events in African history was the gradual spread of Bantu-speaking peoples from their homeland in what is now Nigeria and Cameroon throughout Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. This expansion, which took place over approximately 2,000 years, established the linguistic and cultural foundations for most of modern sub-Saharan Africa. The Bantu expansion began around 1000 BCE and continued until approximately 500 CE. The migrants brought with them iron technology, agricultural practices suited to tropical environments, and the Bantu languages that are ancestral to the hundreds of related languages spoken today by over 300 million Africans. As they moved into new territories, they absorbed or displaced the previous inhabitants, including populations of hunter-gatherers whose descendants survive today as groups like the San of southern Africa. The causes of the Bantu expansion remain debated by scholars. Agricultural productivity may have led to population growth that drove migration. Iron tools may have given Bantu speakers advantages over peoples using stone technology. Climate changes may have opened new territories for settlement. Whatever the causes, the results were transformative, creating a broad cultural continuity across a vast region and establishing the foundation for kingdoms and empires from the Congo to Great Zimbabwe. Fact 54. African textiles. Long before European contact, African peoples developed sophisticated textile traditions using locally available materials, including cotton, raffia palm fiber, and bark cloth. These textiles served practical purposes as clothing and furnishing, but also carried deep cultural significance, communicating social status, ethnic identity, and spiritual beliefs through their patterns and colors. West African weavers produced particularly elaborate cloths, including the famous Kent cloth of the Akan peoples. Kent is woven on narrow strip looms, producing bands of fabric that are then sewn together to create larger cloths. The patterns and colors of Kent have specific meanings. Traditionally, certain patterns were reserved for royalty or special occasions. Today, Kent has become a symbol of African identity worldwide, worn at graduations, weddings, and other significant events. Other African textile traditions include the indigo-dyed cloths of Nigeria, the mud cloths of Mali, and the bark cloths of Uganda. Each tradition developed distinctive techniques, patterns, and meanings. When European traders arrived with manufactured cloth, they often found it difficult to compete with local products that were better suited to African preferences and climate. African textile traditions survived colonialism and continue to thrive today, adapting traditional techniques to contemporary markets. Fact 55. African music and instruments. African musical traditions have had profound influence throughout the world, particularly through the African diaspora in the Americas. The rhythms, scales, and instruments that enslaved Africans brought with them would eventually contribute to the development of jazz, blues, rock and roll, samba, reggae, and countless other musical genres that define modern popular music. African music is characterized by complex polyrhythmic structures in which multiple rhythmic patterns interlock to create a dense rhythmic texture. Instruments include various types of drums, from the talking drums of West Africa to the ngoma drums of East Africa, stringed instruments like the kora, a 21-string harp lute from the Mandinka tradition, and the bira or thumb piano, which produces a distinctive metallic tone. Call and response patterns, in which a leader alternates with a chorus, are common across many African traditions. Music in traditional African societies served functions beyond entertainment. Drummers communicated messages over long distances using talking drums that mimicked the tonal patterns of African languages. Griots used music to preserve and transmit history. Religious ceremonies employed music to communicate with spirits and induce altered states of consciousness. Work songs coordinated labor and made difficult tasks more bearable. This integration of music into daily life helped ensure that African musical traditions survived the trauma of slavery and diaspora. Fact 56. African religions. Before the spread of Islam and Christianity, African peoples developed rich religious traditions that varied widely across the continent, but shared certain common features. These indigenous religions typically recognized a supreme creator deity, venerated ancestors, believed in the spiritual animation of natural phenomena, and employed specialists such as priests, diviners, and healers to mediate between the human and spiritual worlds. Ancestor veneration was particularly important in many African societies. The dead were believed to remain interested in the affairs of their descendants and capable of influencing events in the living world. Ancestors could bring blessings or misfortune depending on whether they were properly honored. Elaborate funeral rituals and periodic ceremonies maintained the connection between the living and the dead, ensuring continued ancestral favor. The arrival of Islam and Christianity transformed African religious landscapes, but the process was rarely simple replacement. In many cases, African converts incorporated elements of their previous beliefs into the new religions, creating distinctive African forms of Islam and Christianity. Practices like ancestor veneration, spirit possession, and consultation with diviners often continued alongside participation in mosque or church services. This religious syncretism produced rich and complex spiritual traditions that defy simple categorization. Fact 57. The spread of Islam in Africa. Islam arrived in Africa almost as soon as the religion itself existed. In 615 CE, just 5 years after Muhammad began his prophetic mission, a group of his early followers fled persecution in Mecca and found refuge in the Christian kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia. This event, known as the First Hijra, established a connection between Islam and Africa that would only grow stronger over the following centuries. The Arab conquest of North Africa in the 7th century brought Islam to the northern shores of the continent, where it eventually displaced Christianity and became the dominant religion. From North Africa, Islam spread southward across the Sahara through the Trans-Saharan trade networks, reaching the great empires of the Sudan by the 11th century. Merchants, scholars, and missionaries carried the faith to new territories, and ruling elites adopted Islam both from sincere conviction and because it facilitated trade with the wealthy Islamic world. The spread of Islam in Africa was generally gradual and peaceful, accomplished through commerce and persuasion rather than conquest. In many areas, Islam coexisted with traditional religions for centuries, and even today, African Islam often incorporates elements from earlier religious traditions. The result is a distinctively African expression of Islam, with its own scholarly traditions, legal interpretations, and religious practices that reflect the continent's cultural diversity. Fact 58. Mansa Musa's architects. When Mansa Musa returned from his pilgrimage to Mecca, he brought back more than religious inspiration. The emperor recruited scholars, artists, and architects from across the Islamic world to help transform Mali into a center of Islamic civilization. Most famous among these recruits was Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Sahili, an Andalusian architect and poet whose work would shape the built environment of the Western Sudan. Al-Sahili is credited with introducing new architectural techniques to Mali, particularly the use of burned brick and the distinctive pyramidal mud brick style that characterizes the great mosques of Timbuktu and Jen. Before his arrival, important buildings in the Sudan were typically constructed from wood, thatch, and sun-dried mud. The techniques al-Sahili introduced allowed for larger, more durable structures that could rival the great mosques of the broader Islamic world. The architectural legacy of al-Sahili and his successors extends far beyond their individual buildings. The Sudano-Sahelian architectural style they developed spread throughout West Africa, influencing building traditions from Senegal to Nigeria. The mud brick mosques of the region, with their distinctive wooden beams protruding from their walls, remain symbols of African Islamic civilization and are recognized today as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Fact 59. Leo Africanus. One of our most important sources for medieval African history is a remarkable traveler known as Leo Africanus, whose description of Africa, published in 1550, provided European readers with their first detailed account of the interior of the continent. His story illustrates the interconnected world of the medieval Mediterranean, where a single life could span multiple cultures, religions, and continents. Leo Africanus was born Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazn al-Faisai around 1494 in Granada, Spain, just as the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia was falling to the Christian reconquest. His family fled to Morocco, where the young Al-Hassan grew up and eventually served as a diplomat and merchant. His travels took him throughout North Africa, across the Sahara to the Sudan, and along the trade routes of the Islamic world. In 1518, while returning from a diplomatic mission, Al-Hassan's ship was captured by Spanish pirates. He was taken to Rome and presented to Pope Leo X, who recognized his intelligence and arranged for his education and baptism. Taking the Christian name Johannes Leo de Medicis, he wrote his famous description of Africa at the Pope's request, drawing on his personal observations and on Arabic geographical texts. His account, while not always accurate, remained the standard European source on the African interior for centuries. Fact 60. The Moroccan-Saharan Crossing. The Moroccan army that destroyed the Songhai Empire in 1591 accomplished one of the most remarkable military feats in African history, crossing the Sahara Desert with a substantial fighting force. This expedition, which covered over 1,000 miles of the world's harshest terrain, demonstrated both the determination of Morocco's sultan and the logistical challenges that limited foreign intervention in sub-Saharan Africa. The army that set out from Morocco numbered approximately 4,000 soldiers, including about 2,000 musketeers equipped with the latest firearms technology. They were accompanied by thousands of camels carrying water, food, ammunition, and 8 cannons. The commander, Judar Pasha was a Spanish convert to Islam who had risen through the ranks of the Moroccan military. Fact 61. Tagaza, the city of salt. Deep in the Sahara Desert, approximately 500 miles north of Timbuktu, lay one of the strangest cities in the world. Tagaza was built entirely from blocks of salt, mined from vast deposits that lay beneath the desert sand. The buildings, the mosque, even the tables and the houses were constructed from rock salt. The city existed for one purpose only: to extract and ship the salt that the empires of the Sudan desperately needed. Working conditions in Tagaza were horrific. The mines were worked by slaves, who excavated salt blocks in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing grew in Tagaza. All food and water had to be brought from hundreds of miles away, making the cost of living astronomical. The merchants who organized the salt trade grew rich, but the workers who actually extracted the salt lived and died in conditions of extreme hardship. Despite its misery, Tagaza was an essential link in the Trans-Saharan trade network. The salt extracted there was carried south by camel caravan to Timbuktu and beyond, where it was exchanged for gold from the forest regions. The taxes collected on this salt helped fund the great empires of the Sudan. When the Moroccans conquered Songhai, one of their goals was to control Tagaza and its precious salt, though they soon discovered that the mines had been worked out and salt production had shifted elsewhere. Fact 62. The kola nut. Among the goods traded northward across the Sahara was a product now largely forgotten but once enormously valuable: the kola nut, a caffeine-rich seed from trees that grew in the forests of West Africa. Kola nuts were one of the few sources of stimulants available in the medieval Islamic world, where alcohol was forbidden, and they became an important trade commodity precisely because of their intoxicating effects. The kola nut trade was controlled by the forest peoples of what is now Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Sierra Leone. These communities harvested the nuts from kola trees and sold them to merchants from the Savannah empires, who transported them northward to the great trading cities. From there, the nuts were carried across the Sahara to markets in North Africa and the Middle East, where the wealthy would pay premium prices for this exotic stimulant. Kola nuts also had important social functions in West African societies. They were exchanged at weddings, naming ceremonies, and other important occasions. They were offered to guests as a sign of hospitality and used in religious ceremonies. The nuts could suppress hunger and fatigue, making them valuable for travelers and workers. When European merchants arrived, they discovered this trade and eventually introduced kola nuts to the Americas, where they would become an ingredient in early Coca-Cola and other beverages. Fact 63. African gold mining. The gold that funded the empires of the Sudan came primarily from the forest regions south of the Savannah, particularly the areas known as Bambuk, Bure, and Akan. Mining techniques were relatively simple but effective, employing methods suited to the shallow alluvial deposits that characterized most West African gold sources. The most common technique was panning, in which miners would scoop sediment from stream beds and riverbeds, then wash it in containers to separate the heavier gold particles from the lighter sand and gravel. This work was often done by women, who would wade into streams during the dry season when water levels were low and carefully process the sediment. The gold dust they recovered was collected in quills or small pouches and sold to traveling merchants. Deeper deposits were sometimes exploited through shaft mining, in which workers dug narrow pits into the earth and extracted gold-bearing soil for washing. These mines could extend 20 or 30 feet underground, supported by wooden props. The work was dangerous, as shafts could collapse, and the tunnels often filled with water during the rainy season. Despite these risks, the profits from gold mining attracted workers from across the region, and the mines continued operating for centuries. Fact 64. The role of women in African empires. Women played significant roles in the political, economic, and social life of African empires, though their prominence varied across different societies. In some kingdoms, women held formal political power as queens or queen mothers. In others, they dominated certain sectors of the economy, particularly trade. Understanding women's roles is essential to a complete picture of African history. In the Kingdom of Congo, the Queen Mother held substantial political power and often served as regent for young kings. In Dahomey, the Amazons were among the most feared military units in West Africa. In Hausa society, women controlled certain markets and trades, accumulating wealth that could rival that of men. In many societies, women were the primary agricultural workers, responsible for growing the food that supported families and communities. Queen Amina of Zaza, who ruled in what is now northern Nigeria during the 16th century, was one of the most famous warrior queens in African history. According to tradition, she led her army in campaigns that expanded Zazo's territory and established walled camps that grew into important cities. Whether all the details of her legend are accurate, she represents a broader pattern of powerful women who shaped African history in ways that challenge stereotypes about women's roles in traditional societies. Fact 65. The importance of oral tradition. The history of African empires comes to us through two main types of sources: the written accounts of Arab travelers and scholars, and the oral traditions preserved and transmitted by African peoples themselves. These oral traditions, long dismissed or ignored by Western scholars, have proven to be invaluable sources of historical information when properly analyzed. Oral traditions in Africa were not casual storytelling but highly formalized systems of historical preservation. Professional historians like the griots of West Africa spent years memorizing genealogies, epic narratives, and historical accounts. These specialists served important social functions, advising rulers, settling disputes, and maintaining the collective memory of their communities. The accuracy of their memories was often remarkable, with details confirmed by archaeological evidence and written sources. Modern historians have learned to use oral traditions carefully, recognizing both their value and their limitations. Oral accounts can provide perspectives missing from written sources, which were often produced by outsiders. They preserve information about social structures, religious beliefs, and everyday life that literate observers might have missed or misunderstood. At the same time, oral traditions can change over time as they are adapted to new circumstances, requiring careful analysis to distinguish ancient elements from later additions. Fact 66. Archaeological discoveries. While written sources and oral traditions tell us much about African empires, archaeology has revealed dimensions of African history that no other source could provide. Excavations across the continent have uncovered the material remains of past societies, from the foundations of their buildings to the artifacts of their daily lives, offering concrete evidence of African achievements that some once doubted. The archaeological investigation of Great Zimbabwe demolished claims that the site was built by non-Africans. Excavations at Kumbi Sala revealed the remains of the Ghana Empire's capital, confirming and expanding upon the descriptions left by Arab writers. Work at Ife in Nigeria uncovered sophisticated bronze and terracotta sculptures that revolutionized understanding of African artistic traditions. Each dig adds new information to our understanding of the African past. Archaeological work in Africa faces significant challenges, including limited funding, political instability in some regions, and the sheer vastness of the continent. Many important sites remain unexcavated, their secrets still buried beneath the soil. Yet the work continues, driven by African and international scholars determined to recover the full story of African civilization. Each discovery adds new chapters to a history that is still being written. FACT 67. African metallurgy beyond iron. While iron was the most important metal worked by African peoples, it was far from the only one. African metallurgists also worked copper, bronze, brass, gold, and silver, creating objects of remarkable beauty and technical sophistication. These metalworking traditions developed independently in Africa and reached levels of achievement that rivaled or exceeded those of contemporary Europe. The bronze and brass casting traditions of West Africa are particularly impressive. Artists in Ife and Benin produce sculptures using the lost wax technique, in which a wax model is encased in clay. The wax is melted out, and molten metal is poured into the resulting mold. This technique requires precise temperature control and detailed knowledge of metal properties. The bronzes produced by these methods, some dating back to the 12th century, display a naturalism and technical mastery that astonished European observers. Goldworking was another area of African excellence. The Akan peoples of modern Ghana developed sophisticated techniques for working the gold that was so abundant in their region. They created intricate jewelry, ceremonial objects, and the famous gold weights that served as both measures and miniature sculptures. The gold artifacts looted from African kingdoms during the colonial period now fill museums around the world, testimony to artistic traditions that flourished for centuries before European contact. Fact 68. The desert trade routes. The Trans-Saharan trade did not follow a single route but rather multiple pathways across the world's largest desert. Different routes connected different origin and destination points, and their relative importance shifted over time as political conditions changed and new trade opportunities emerged. Understanding these routes helps explain the rise and fall of different African kingdoms. The western routes connected Morocco to the Senegal River region and to the empires of Ghana and Mali. These routes passed through oases like Sijil Massa in Morocco and Oued Ghost in the desert before reaching Kumbisala or Timbuktu. The central routes connected Tunisia and Libya to the Lake Chad basin and the Hausa city-states. The eastern routes linked Egypt to the kingdoms of the Central Sudan. Each route had its own history, its own controlling powers, and its own mix of traded goods. Travel along these routes required careful planning and cooperation among multiple parties. Caravans typically departed in the fall, after the worst of the summer heat had passed but before winter rains made certain stretches impassable. They moved from oasis to oasis in carefully timed stages, knowing that delays could mean death by dehydration. The Berber peoples of the desert, particularly the Tuareg, served as guides, guards, and transporters, their knowledge of the routes essential to the trade's success. Fact 69. The Tuareg people. No discussion of the Trans-Saharan trade would be complete without mentioning the Tuareg, the Berber people who made the desert their home and who controlled much of the caravan trade for over 1,000 years. The Tuareg developed a distinctive culture adapted to the harsh desert environment, including the famous indigo-dyed veils that gave them their nickname, the Blue People of the Desert. Tuareg society was hierarchical and complex. At the top were noble clans who controlled the best pastures and the most important trade routes. Below them were vassal clans who owed service and tribute. At the bottom were former slaves and their descendants who performed agricultural labor in the oases. This social structure supported a nomadic lifestyle in which different groups moved seasonally across vast territories, following pasture and trade opportunities. The Tuareg developed remarkable adaptations to desert life. Their camel breeding expertise produced animals perfectly suited to long desert crossings. Their knowledge of water sources and navigable routes was passed down through generations. Their warriors, mounted on fast-riding camels and armed with swords and spears, were formidable fighters who could appear suddenly from the desert to raid caravans or settlements. The Tuareg remain a significant population in Mali, Niger, Algeria, and Libya today, though their traditional way of life has been challenged by national borders and modern development. Fact 70. African slavery before Europeans. Slavery existed in Africa long before European ships arrived on the continent's shores. Various forms of unfree labor were practiced across the continent, ranging from chattel slavery similar to the later Atlantic system to more moderate forms of bondage that allowed slaves certain rights and the possibility of integration into their owners' families. Understanding African slavery is essential to understanding the continent's history, though it should never be used to excuse or minimize the Atlantic slave trade. In many African societies, slaves were war captives, criminals, or debtors who had been reduced to bondage as punishment. They might work as agricultural laborers, domestic servants, soldiers, or even administrators. In some societies, the children of slaves were considered free. In others, slaves could marry, own property, and purchase their freedom. The treatment of slaves varied enormously across different African cultures and time periods. The demand created by the Atlantic slave trade transformed African slavery in terrible ways. As European purchasers created an apparently unlimited market for slaves, African rulers and merchants organized ever larger slave-capturing operations, destabilizing entire regions through constant warfare. The relatively moderate forms of African slavery were overwhelmed by the industrial scale of the Atlantic system. The distinction between African and Atlantic slavery is important, but the latter ultimately corrupted and brutalized the former. Fact 71. African mathematics. African peoples developed mathematical systems suited to their particular needs and cultural contexts. While these systems differed from the mathematical traditions that developed in Europe and Asia, they were often sophisticated and effective, solving problems of commerce, construction, and astronomy with methods that deserve recognition as genuine mathematical achievements. The Yoruba people of Nigeria developed a complex counting system based on 20 rather than 10. This vigesimal system allowed for efficient calculation of large numbers and was well adapted to commercial transactions. The Ishengo bone, discovered in the Democratic Republic of Congo and dating back approximately 20,000 years, bears markings that some scholars interpret as the earliest known mathematical calculations, suggesting that mathematical thinking in Africa has very deep roots. In the great centers of Islamic learning like Timbuktu, African scholars participated in the broader mathematical traditions of the Muslim world. They studied and copied texts on algebra, geometry, and astronomy, adding their own contributions and adaptations. The manuscripts of Timbuktu include mathematical works that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of these subjects. African mathematics was not primitive or undeveloped. It was simply different from European traditions and has been underappreciated by scholars working within Western frameworks. Fact 72. The Niger River. The Niger River was the lifeblood of the Great Sudanese empires, providing water, transportation, and fertile floodplains in an otherwise arid landscape. This great river, the third longest in Africa after the Nile and the Congo, traces a remarkable course that bends northward into the Sahara before turning south toward the Atlantic, creating the Niger Bend that was the heartland of Mali and Songhai. The Niger's annual flood cycle was crucial to agriculture in the region. Each rainy season, the river swelled with water from the highlands of Guinea, spreading across floodplains and creating temporary lakes. As the waters receded, they left behind fertile silt deposits perfect for agriculture. Farmers planted their crops in this enriched soil, harvesting before the next flood arrived. This flood retreat agriculture supported the dense populations that made great empires possible. The transportation on the Niger connected the disparate parts of the Sudanese empires. Canoes and larger boats carried goods and passengers along the river, avoiding the slow and dangerous overland routes. Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao all owed their importance partly to their positions on the river. Even warfare was shaped by the Niger. the Songhai maintained a fleet of war canoes that gave them military mobility unmatched by their rivals. Fact 73. African agriculture. The agricultural systems that supported African empires were sophisticated adaptations to diverse and often challenging environments. African farmers developed crops, techniques, and knowledge suited to tropical conditions, creating productive agricultural systems that sustained large populations and generated the surpluses that empires required. Different regions produced different staple crops. Sorghum and millet, domesticated in Africa thousands of years ago, were the primary grains of the Sahel and savanna regions. Rice, both African and Asian varieties, was cultivated in river valleys and wetlands. Yams and other root crops dominated in the forest zones. These crops were supplemented by vegetables, fruits, and animal products, creating diverse diets suited to local conditions. African farmers developed sophisticated techniques for managing their environments. They used controlled burning to clear land and return nutrients to the soil. They practiced fallowing systems that allowed exhausted fields to recover. They developed irrigation systems where water was available and drought-resistant varieties where it was not. This accumulated agricultural knowledge, transmitted across generations, made it possible for millions of people to thrive in environments that European colonizers often dismissed as unproductive. Fact 74. The royal courts. The courts of African kings were centers of power, culture, and ceremony that impressed even the most sophisticated foreign visitors. These courts displayed the wealth of their rulers, demonstrated their power over subjects and rivals, and served as arenas for the political negotiations that held empires together. Understanding court culture helps us understand how African rulers maintained their authority. The court of the Mansa of Mali, as described by Ibn Battuta during his visit in 1352, featured elaborate ceremonies designed to emphasize the ruler's majesty. The Mansa appeared before his subjects seated on a platform covered with silk, surrounded by nobles, soldiers, and slaves. Musicians played, poets recited praises, and petitioners prostrated themselves before the throne. Every detail of dress, position, and behavior communicated messages about power and status. Similar courtly cultures developed in kingdoms across Africa. The Oba of Benin appeared before his people surrounded by bronze plaques depicting his ancestors' achievements. The Asantehene of Ashanti sat beneath great umbrellas surrounded by gold-laden attendants. The kings of Rwanda and Burundi maintained elaborate courts with distinctive ceremonial traditions. These court cultures were not merely decorative. They were essential tools for projecting power and maintaining the loyalty of subjects and allies. Fact 75. African military innovations. African armies developed distinctive military traditions suited to their particular environments and enemies. While African forces were eventually overwhelmed by European firepower during the colonial period, for most of history they were formidable fighting forces that defended their territories effectively and sometimes projected power over vast distances. Cavalry was crucial in the open savanna regions, where mounted warriors could move quickly and strike with devastating force. The empires of the Sudan maintained large cavalry forces, their horses bred for endurance, and their riders trained from childhood. These cavalry armies conquered vast territories and maintained control over far-flung provinces. In the forest regions, where horses could not survive due to tsetse flies, infantry forces predominated, often organized into disciplined units with specialized functions. African armies also developed sophisticated strategies and tactics. The Zulu reforms under Shaka created one of the most effective military systems in African history. The fortification traditions of many African peoples produced defensive works that could resist siege for months or years. Diplomatic and political skills complemented military prowess, Successful African commanders understood when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to withdraw. Fact 76. The Muslim scholars of Timbuktu. The scholars who made Timbuktu famous were not isolated intellectuals, but members of a vibrant community that attracted students from across the Islamic world. These scholars taught, wrote, debated, and corresponded with colleagues in Cairo, Fez, and beyond, participating fully in the intellectual life of medieval Islam. Their achievements deserve recognition alongside those of scholars in any other medieval center of learning. The curriculum of Timbuktu's schools centered on Islamic religious sciences, Quranic interpretation, hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, and Islamic jurisprudence. But scholars also studied grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The breadth of learning reflected in the surviving manuscripts shows that Timbuktu was not a narrow religious academy, but a genuine university in the medieval sense, where multiple disciplines were taught and studied. The most famous scholar of Timbuktu was Ahmad Baba, who lived from 1556 to 1627 and wrote over 40 works on various subjects. When the Moroccans conquered Timbuktu in 1591, they recognized Ahmad Baba as the city's leading intellectual and eventually took him to Morocco, where he continued his scholarly work. His career illustrates both the achievements of Timbuktu's scholarly tradition and its tragic disruption by foreign conquest. Fact 77. The end of the Trans-Saharan trade. The Trans-Saharan trade that had enriched African empires for centuries gradually declined after the 16th century, replaced by the Atlantic maritime trade that European powers dominated. This shift had profound consequences for African history, redirecting trade routes, enriching different regions, and creating the conditions for the devastating Atlantic slave trade. Several factors contributed to the decline. The Portuguese discovery of sea routes to West Africa allowed European merchants to bypass the Saharan crossing entirely, purchasing gold and other goods directly at coastal ports. The Moroccan conquest of Songhai disrupted the political stability that had protected the Trans-Saharan routes. European manufactured goods, available at coastal trading posts, competed with the traditional products carried across the desert. The decline was gradual rather than sudden. Trans-Saharan trade continued into the 19th century and even exists in diminished form today. But the great days were over. The cities of the Sahel, deprived of their commercial lifeblood, entered long declines. The interior regions that had been the heart of great empires became backwaters as economic power shifted to the coast. 1,000 years of commercial history drew slowly to a close. Fact 78. African resistance to colonialism. The European conquest of Africa in the late 19th century met with determined resistance from African peoples who fought to defend their independence. This resistance took many forms, from conventional warfare to guerrilla campaigns to diplomatic maneuvering, and while it ultimately failed against superior European firepower, it demonstrated African peoples' determination to control their own destinies. Some African states possessed military capabilities that allowed them to challenge European forces directly. The Ethiopian victory at Adwa demonstrated that African armies could defeat European invaders under the right circumstances. The Zulu defeated the British at Isandlwana before being eventually overwhelmed. The Ashanti fought multiple wars against the British before their final conquest in 1900. These and many other examples show that African resistance was serious and sustained. Where conventional military resistance failed, other forms of opposition emerged. Religious movements mobilized populations against colonial rule. Some communities simply refused to cooperate with colonial demands, practicing what might be called passive resistance. Others fled to remote areas beyond colonial control. The seeds of the independence movements that would eventually end colonial rule were planted in these early acts of resistance. Fact 79. The scramble for Africa. The European partition of Africa in the late 19th century, sometimes called the Scramble for Africa, divided the continent among European powers with almost complete disregard for African peoples and their existing political arrangements. In the space of about 20 years, virtually the entire continent fell under European colonial control, ending the independence that African states had maintained for millennia. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 established the rules by which European powers would divide Africa among themselves. Representatives of 14 nations, none of them African, drew lines on maps that would become the borders of colonial territories. These borders often divided ethnic groups, combined hostile populations, and ignored natural boundaries, creating problems that persist to the present day. The conquest itself was accomplished through a combination of military force, diplomatic manipulation, and technological advantage. European machine guns mowed down African armies still using traditional weapons. European steamships navigated rivers that had been barriers to overland travel. European medicines, particularly quinine, protected soldiers from tropical diseases that had previously limited European penetration of the African interior. Within a generation, a continent of independent kingdoms had become a continent of European colonies. Fact 80. The colonial economy. Colonial rule fundamentally reoriented African economies away from the internal trade networks that had sustained the great empires and toward the export of raw materials to European markets. This economic transformation had lasting effects that would shape African development long after independence. Colonial powers forced African populations to produce cash crops like cotton, cocoa, peanuts, and palm oil for export rather than food for local consumption. They built railways and roads designed to move goods from interior regions to coastal ports, not to connect African communities with each other. They extracted minerals, particularly gold and diamonds in southern Africa, using African labor under conditions ranging from wage employment to virtual slavery. The economic legacy of colonialism remains controversial. Colonial apologists point to infrastructure investments and the introduction of new technologies. Critics note that this infrastructure served European interests, that colonial taxation impoverished African communities, and that the extraction of resources left African countries dependent on volatile commodity markets. The economic structures established during colonialism continue to influence African economies today, for better and for worse. Fact 81. African independence movements. The colonial period, though devastating, proved to be a relatively brief interlude in African history. Beginning in the 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s, African peoples won their independence from European powers, establishing the independent nations that exist today. This decolonization was one of the major political transformations of the 20th century. Independence came through various paths. In some countries, like Ghana, independence was won through peaceful political organizing led by figures like Kwame Nkrumah. In others, like Algeria and Kenya, bloody liberation wars were necessary to dislodge colonial powers. In southern Africa, white settler regimes held on longer, with Zimbabwe not achieving majority rule until 1980 and South Africa not ending apartheid until 1994. The leaders of African independence movements drew inspiration from their continent's history, including the great empires of the past. They sought to create modern nations that would recapture African dignity and development potential. The challenges they faced were enormous. Colonial borders that made little sense, economies designed to serve European interests, populations with limited education, and few economic resources. The struggles of post-colonial Africa cannot be understood without reference to these colonial legacies. Fact 82. The persistence of African culture. Despite the disruptions of the slave trade, colonialism, and modernization, African cultural traditions have shown remarkable persistence and resilience. Traditional music, art, religious practices, and social customs continue to flourish across the continent, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining connections to ancient roots. This cultural persistence is evident in many domains. The griot traditions of West Africa continue to this day, with modern griots performing at ceremonies and recording albums that bring their ancient art to new audiences. Traditional religious practices coexist with Christianity and Islam, often blending elements of all three traditions. Artistic styles with centuries-old roots continue to influence contemporary African artists, who combine traditional techniques with modern media and global influences. The African diaspora has also maintained and transformed African cultural traditions. In the Americas, African religious practices evolved into traditions like Vodou, Santeria, and Candomblé. African musical traditions contributed to the development of jazz, blues, rock, and hip-hop. African-derived cooking traditions, linguistic patterns, and social practices remain visible throughout the African diaspora. The cultural contributions of Africa extend far beyond the continent itself. Fact 83. Timbuktu today. The city of Timbuktu still exists today, though it is a shadow of its former glory. Home to approximately 50,000 people in the modern nation of Mali, the city faces challenges including poverty, desertification, and political instability. Yet efforts continue to preserve its remarkable heritage and to restore its position as a center of learning and culture. The ancient mosques of Timbuktu, including the Djinguereber, Sankor, and Sidi Yahya mosques, still stand and are still used for worship. These buildings require constant maintenance, as the mud brick construction must be regularly replastered to survive the rainy season. Community members gather each year for the traditional replastering ceremonies, maintaining a practice that connects them to centuries of ancestors. The manuscripts of Timbuktu remain one of the city's greatest treasures and greatest challenges. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, many held in private family collections, require conservation work to prevent their deterioration. International organizations have worked with local partners to digitize manuscripts, train conservators, and establish proper storage facilities. During the 2012 conflict in Mali, when extremist groups threatened to destroy the manuscripts, local librarians heroically smuggled thousands of texts to safety, demonstrating the continued importance of this heritage to the people of Timbuktu. Fact 84. Great Zimbabwe's lasting impact. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe continue to inspire and inform African identity in the modern era. The modern nation of Zimbabwe took its name from these ancient ruins when it achieved independence in 1980, deliberately claiming this pre-colonial heritage as the foundation of national identity. The Zimbabwe bird, a soapstone sculpture found at the ruins, appears on the national flag and currency. Archaeological work at Great Zimbabwe continues to reveal new information about the civilization that built it. Recent excavations have uncovered additional artifacts, refined understanding of the site's chronology, and confirmed the African origins that racist colonial scholars once denied. The site is now a major tourist attraction and a source of national pride for Zimbabweans. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe extends beyond the nation that bears its name. The ruins stand as permanent evidence of African achievement, challenging stereotypes and inspiring pride throughout the African diaspora. They demonstrate that sophisticated urban civilization existed in Africa centuries before European contact, a fact that remains important in ongoing debates about African history and capabilities. Fact 85. Mansa Musa's global fame. Mansa Musa has become, in recent years, one of the most famous figures of medieval history, his story spreading through popular media to audiences who might never have heard of Mali or the Trans-Saharan trade. His designation as possibly the richest person in history has captured imaginations worldwide, making him a symbol of African achievement and a corrective to stereotypes about African poverty. This fame has come largely through the internet and social media, where lists of history's wealthiest people regularly feature Mansa Musa at or near the top. His pilgrimage to Mecca, with its legendary distributions of gold, makes for compelling storytelling that is spread across platforms and formats. Educational videos, infographics, and articles have introduced Mansa Musa to millions who might never have encountered him in traditional history education. The popularization of Mansa Musa's story represents both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, it introduces important African history to broad audiences and challenges assumptions about Africa as a continent of poverty and underdevelopment. On the other hand, there is a risk that Mansa Musa becomes a token, his story standing in for the entire complex history of African empires rather than serving as an invitation to learn more. The goal should be not just to know about Mansa Musa, but to understand the civilization that produced him. Fact 86. African languages and writing. While the empires of the Sudan used Arabic for formal writing, Africa has a rich history of indigenous writing systems that developed independently of outside influence. These writing systems, though less well known than alphabets from other parts of the world, demonstrate African ingenuity and the human drive to record language in permanent form. The most famous indigenous African script is the Ethiopian Goezi alphabet, which developed from ancient South Arabian writing and has been used continuously for over 2,000 years. Goezi remains in use today for religious texts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Other indigenous African scripts include the Vice syllabary of Liberia, developed in the 1830s, and the Nsibidi system of symbols used by the Ekpe Society in Nigeria, which may predate European contact. The question of writing in Africa is complicated by the fact that many African societies chose to preserve their knowledge through oral rather than written traditions. This choice was not a sign of inability, but rather a different approach to knowledge preservation. The griot traditions of West Africa, for example, developed sophisticated techniques for accurate transmission of information across generations, achieving results that in some ways exceeded what writing could accomplish. Fact 87. The Fulani Jihads. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a series of religious reform movements led by Fulani Muslim scholars that reshaped the political map of West Africa. These jihads, or holy wars, established new states committed to stricter observance of Islamic law and created political entities that would endure until European conquest. The most significant of these movements was the jihad led by Usman Dan Fodio, which began in 1804 and eventually created the Sokoto Caliphate, covering much of what is now northern Nigeria. Usman Dan Fodio, a scholar and teacher, called for reform of the Hausa city-states, whose rulers he accused of mixing Islam with pagan practices. When the Hausa kings rejected his demands, he launched a military campaign that overthrew them and established a new political order. The Sokoto Caliphate and similar states created by Fulani jihads represented a significant political innovation. They were explicitly religious states, governed according to Islamic law as interpreted by their founders. They brought a degree of political unity to regions that had previously been fragmented among competing kingdoms. Their legacy remains visible in modern West Africa, where the political influence of traditional Muslim rulers continues to be significant. Fact 88. The Asante Golden Stool. The Golden Stool of Asante is one of the most powerful symbols of African political and spiritual authority, a sacred object that embodies the soul of the Asante nation. According to tradition, the stool descended from heaven in a cloud of white dust and landed on the lap of Osei Tutu, the founder of the Asante Confederacy, in the late 17th century. From that moment, the stool became the symbol of Asante unity and independence. The golden stool was not a throne to be sat upon, even by the Asantehene, the king of Asante. Rather, it was a sacred object that was carefully protected and displayed only on special occasions. It was believed to contain the sunsum, or soul, of the Asante people, and its welfare was connected to the welfare of the nation. If the stool were to be captured or destroyed, the Asante believed their nation would cease to exist. When British Governor Frederick Hodgson demanded in 1900 to sit on the golden stool, he sparked a war. The Asante, led by Queen Mother Yaa Asantewaa, rose in rebellion against British rule. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed, the golden stool was never surrendered. It was hidden in a secret location until 1921, when it was accidentally discovered and returned to the Asantehene. The stool remains in Asante custody today, a powerful symbol of African resistance to colonial domination. Fact 89. The Songhai Navy. While we often think of African military power in terms of cavalry and infantry, the Songhai Empire maintained one of the few naval forces in the interior of Africa. The Songhai fleet, composed of war canoes operating on the Niger River, gave the empire a military capability that its rivals could not match and allowed it to project power along hundreds of miles of river. The war canoes of Songhai were substantial vessels, some capable of carrying dozens of warriors. They were propelled by paddlers and could move quickly both with and against the current. Armed warriors would engage enemy forces from the boats or use them to transport troops for amphibious operations. The control of the river that these canoes provided was essential to Songhai's ability to govern its vast empire. The existence of the Songhai Navy illustrates the importance of adapting military technology to specific environments. In the savanna regions away from the river, cavalry was the dominant military arm. On the river itself, naval power was supreme. Songhai's ability to excel in both domains helped explain its military success and its ability to maintain control over territories that stretched from the Atlantic nearly to Lake Chad. Fact 90. African astronomy. African peoples developed astronomical knowledge suited to their practical needs, particularly agriculture and navigation. While this knowledge was often expressed in mythological rather than scientific terms, it represented genuine understanding of celestial phenomena accumulated through centuries of careful observation. Many African societies developed calendars based on astronomical observation. The Dogon people of Mali possessed detailed knowledge of the stars, including information about Sirius and its companion star that has puzzled researchers. The ancient Egyptians, of course, developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge that allowed them to predict the Nile floods and construct monuments aligned with celestial bodies. In the Muslim learning centers of Timbuktu and other cities, scholars studied the astronomical traditions of the broader Islamic world. Practical astronomical knowledge was essential for the caravans crossing the Sahara, who navigated by the stars across trackless desert. Fishermen along the coasts and rivers used astronomical observations to time their activities with tides and seasons. Farmers throughout Africa scheduled their planting and harvesting according to celestial indicators. This practical astronomical knowledge, embedded in cultural traditions, represented genuine scientific achievement even when not expressed in formal mathematical terms. Fact 91. The Mali Empire's extent. At its greatest extent under Mansa Musa and his successors, the Mali Empire covered an area of approximately 1.24 million square kilometers, making it one of the largest empires in the world at that time. This vast territory stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the city of Gao in the east, from the salt mines of the Central Sahara in the north to the gold-producing forests in the south. Governing such a vast and diverse territory required sophisticated administrative systems. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials appointed by the Mansa and responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and providing military forces when required. Communication across these distances was slow by modern standards but effective, with messengers traveling the empire's roads and rivers to carry instructions and news. The empire's extent meant that it encompassed many different peoples, languages, and traditions. The Mandinka were the ruling group, but the empire also included Sonic, Fulani, Songhai, Tuareg, and many others. This diversity was managed through a combination of military force and diplomatic accommodation, with local rulers often allowed to maintain their positions as long as they acknowledged Mali's overlordship and paid required tribute. Fact 92. African trade with China. The trade connections of African empires extended far beyond the Mediterranean world. Chinese porcelain has been found at archaeological sites across eastern Africa, from the Swahili coast to Great Zimbabwe, demonstrating that African traders were connected to the global trade networks that span from China to Europe. This trade was indirect. Chinese goods traveled across the Indian Ocean in Arab, Persian, and Indian ships, changing hands multiple times before reaching African markets. African goods, particularly ivory, gold, and exotic animals, made the reverse journey. The presence of Chinese ceramics at African sites does not mean that Chinese traders visited Africa regularly, but it does demonstrate Africa's integration into the medieval global economy. The most dramatic contact between Africa and China came in the early 15th century, when the Chinese Admiral Zheng led several expeditions to the East African coast. His massive treasure ships, far larger than anything in European navies of the time, visited Malindi and other Swahili ports, exchanging gifts with local rulers and even bringing a giraffe back to the Chinese emperor. These expeditions demonstrated the possibility of direct China-Africa contact, though they were not continued after Zheng He's death. Fact 93. The role of camels in African history. The introduction of the camel to Africa was one of the most transformative events in the continent's history, enabling the Trans-Saharan trade that would enrich empires for over a millennium. Without the camel, the great empires of the Sudan might never have risen to their positions of wealth and power. Camels were introduced to North Africa from Arabia sometime in the 1st century CE, gradually replacing horses and donkeys as the primary beasts of burden for desert travel. The camel's ability to travel for days without water, to survive on sparse desert vegetation, and to carry heavy loads across sandy terrain made it uniquely suited to Saharan conditions. A single camel could carry up to 400 pounds of cargo across distances that would have been impossible for any other animal. The peoples who mastered camel husbandry, particularly the Berber tribes who became known as Tuareg, gained control of the desert trade routes. They bred camels, trained them for specific purposes, and accumulated knowledge of desert conditions that made them essential partners for any merchant wishing to cross the Sahara. The camel was not just an animal in African history, it was a technology that transformed the possible. Fact 94. Djenné's Great Mosque. The Great Mosque of Djenné, rebuilt in its current form in 1907 but based on a 13th century original, is the largest mud brick building in the world and one of the most remarkable achievements of African architecture. This massive structure, capable of holding 3,000 worshippers, demonstrates that impressive architecture does not require stone or steel. The mosque is constructed entirely from sun-dried mud bricks, with walls up to 2 feet thick that provide insulation against the intense Saharan heat. Wooden beams project from the walls, serving both as scaffolding for the annual replastering and as decorative elements. The building's 3 towers, topped with ostrich eggs symbolizing fertility and purity, have become iconic symbols of African Islamic architecture. Each year, the entire community of Djenné participates in the crepissage, the replastering of the mosque's walls. This festival, which takes place before the rainy season, is both a practical necessity and a celebration of community solidarity. Residents mix mud with rice husks and water, then apply the mixture to the walls by hand, maintaining a building that has stood for over a century. The Great Mosque of Jen is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a powerful symbol of African architectural achievement. Fact 95. The legacy of Sundiata. The Epic of Sundiata, preserved and performed by griots for over 800 years, remains one of the foundational texts of West African culture. This oral epic, which tells the story of the founder of the Mali Empire, continues to be performed today, connecting modern audiences to their medieval heritage. The epic contains much more than the historical facts of Sundiata's life. It incorporates mythology, moral instruction, genealogy, and entertainment, serving multiple functions for its audiences. Listeners learn about the proper behavior of rulers, the importance of destiny and perseverance, and the connections between modern families and their ancient ancestors. The epic is both history and scripture, entertainment and education. Modern versions of the Sundiata epic have been written down, translated into many languages, and adapted into various media. Yet the heart of the tradition remains oral performance by griots who have memorized the epic from their elders. These performances are not mere recitations, but dynamic events in which the griot adapts the telling to the audience and occasion. Through the griots, Sundiata lives on, his story continuing to inspire new generations. Fact 96. African philosophy. African peoples developed rich philosophical traditions that addressed fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, ethics, and the nature of reality. While these traditions were often expressed through proverbs, myths, and religious practices rather than formal treatises, they represented sophisticated intellectual engagement with the deepest questions of human life. Ubuntu, a philosophical concept found throughout southern Africa, exemplifies African philosophical thinking. Often translated as "I am because we are," Ubuntu emphasizes the fundamental interconnection of human beings and the ethical obligations that arise from this connection. A person who has Ubuntu treats others with respect, compassion, and generosity, recognizing that individual well-being depends on community well-being. In the Islamic learning centers of Africa, scholars engaged with the philosophical traditions of the broader Muslim world, studying logic, metaphysics, and ethics. Ahmad Baba of Timbuktu, for example, wrote works addressing philosophical questions within an Islamic framework. These scholars were participants in global intellectual conversations, not isolated thinkers cut off from the wider world. Fact 97. The African diaspora's remembrance. Throughout the African diaspora, descendants of enslaved Africans have worked to recover and honor the heritage of their ancestors, including the great empires that flourished before the slave trade. This recovery work has been both scholarly and popular, producing academic research and cultural movements that have transformed understanding of African history. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s included significant engagement with African history as African American intellectuals sought to counter racist narratives by highlighting African achievements. Later movements, including Pan-Africanism and Afrocentrism, continued this work of recovery and celebration. Today, the study of African empires is a standard part of world history curricula, a change that reflects decades of advocacy by diaspora scholars and communities. This diaspora interest in African history has sometimes been criticized for romanticizing the past or for claiming connections that are historically questionable. But the underlying impulse to recover a history that was systematically suppressed and denied is both understandable and important. The story of African empires belongs not only to those who live in Africa today, but to the millions worldwide whose ancestors were torn from the continent by the slave trade. Fact 98. The continuing importance of African history. The history of African empires matters not only for understanding the past, but for navigating the present and future. The achievements of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, and other African states demonstrate that sophisticated civilization is not the exclusive property of any race or region. This demonstration remains important in a world where racist assumptions about African inferiority persist. African history also offers lessons for contemporary challenges. The environmental strategies of African farmers, the diplomatic traditions of African states, and the philosophical insights of African thinkers all have potential relevance to modern problems. The history of how African societies adapted to difficult environments, managed diverse populations, and maintained traditions across centuries of change offers resources for thinking about similar challenges today. Finally, African history is simply fascinating in its own right. The stories of warrior queens and scholar kings, of golden caravans crossing the desert and stone cities rising in the forest, are as compelling as any tales from European or Asian history. They deserve to be known and remembered not because they serve some contemporary political agenda, but because they are part of the human story, our shared heritage as a species. Fact 99. The journey continues. As our gentle journey through the history of African empires draws to a close, remember that this is not an ending but an invitation. The 99 facts we have explored tonight are merely windows into a vast and complex history, one that scholars are still uncovering and that offers endless opportunities for further discovery. The story of Africa's great empires is not finished. It continues to unfold as new evidence emerges and new generations engage with the past. The empires of the Sudan, the kingdoms of the forest, the city-states of the coast, all rose, flourished, and eventually fell, as all human creations do. But their legacy lives on in the peoples who descend from them, in the cultural traditions they established, and in the physical remains they left behind. The mosques of Timbuktu still stand, the manuscripts still exist, and the griots still sing of Sundiata's triumphs. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you the knowledge that African history is rich and deep, that great civilizations flourished across the continent for millennia, and that this history belongs to all of humanity. The golden courts of Mali, the stone towers of Zimbabwe, the scholar's lamp burning late in Timbuktu, all are part of the human story. May these images accompany you into peaceful dreams. And so we reach the end of our journey together, weary traveler. We have wandered through centuries of African history, from the legendary gold of Ghana to the scholarly traditions of Timbuktu, from the warrior queens of Ndongo to the stone mysteries of Great Zimbabwe. These stories, long overlooked in many histories of the world, deserve their place alongside the tales of any civilization. As sleep approaches, let the images of this journey settle gently into your mind. Picture the camel caravans crossing the endless Sahara, their bells chiming softly in the desert air. Imagine the court of Mansa Musa, glittering with gold that would astound the world. See the scholars of Timbuktu, bent over their manuscripts by lamplight, preserving knowledge for future generations. These are not fairy tales but real history, the stories of real people who built, traded, worshipped, fought, loved, and dreamed beneath the African sun and stars. Their achievements challenge us to expand our understanding of human potential and to recognize genius wherever it appears. Now, let these thoughts drift away like clouds across a moonlit sky. Let your breathing slow, your muscles relax, and your mind release the day's concerns. The empires of Africa have endured in memory for centuries. They will still be there when you awaken. For now, simply rest. Good night, weary traveler. May your dreams be golden.